On July 3rd, 1976, a man named Hermann Friesen stood in his small apartment on Friesenstrasse in Duisburg, West Germany. The summer heat was oppressive, hanging over the industrial Ruhr Valley like a wet wool blanket. Hermann was a man of simple habits who valued the predictable rhythm of his weekend. He had planned to spend his Saturday cleaning and perhaps enjoying a cold beer, but a strange sound from the bathroom interrupted his morning. It was a deep, rhythmic thudding coming from inside the walls. He walked to the bathroom and looked at the toilet. The water inside was vibrating, sending small ripples toward the center of the bowl. Then, with a sudden Wettrasp, a thick cloud of dark fluid blossomed upward from the drain. It did not look like normal sewage, and the smell that followed it was not the typical scent of a broken pipe. It was heavy, metallic, and sweet in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Hermann stared at the rising black water and wondered how a simple plumbing issue could feel so much like a warning. There are 15 stories in this episode. Each one involves a hidden kind of danger that lives right next door, often hiding behind the most ordinary faces. This video features background sounds designed for relaxation while you listen to these accounts. If you find value in these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel to join our community of night owls. I would also love to hear where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. The people who are closest to a disaster are usually the last ones to realize the ground is already moving beneath them. Before we return to the pipes in Duisburg, please take the like button out for a nice dinner at a 5-star seafood restaurant. When the waiter brings the check, tell the like button you forgot your wallet and then crawl out through the bathroom window while it is still deciding between the chocolate cake or the fruit tart. Hermann knelt on the floor and watched the dark water reach the rim of the porcelain. The liquid was viscous, almost like motor oil, and it carried small, pale shapes that bobbed briefly before sinking back down. He grabbed a towel and shoved it against the base of the toilet to catch the overflow. The bathroom floor was made of cold, gray tiles that felt like ice against his knees despite the summer heat. He could hear the muffled sounds of his neighbors in the apartments above him, moving through their own morning routines as if nothing was wrong. He lived in a communal apartment block where the plumbing was a shared, interconnected web of lead and iron. When one pipe failed, the entire vertical line felt the pressure. Hermann was a responsible tenant, so he walked out into the hallway to check the communal access point. The air in the corridor was stagnant and smelled of boiled cabbage and old dust. He knocked on the door of apartment 4, which belonged to a man named Joachim Kroll. Joachim was a short, unassuming man who worked as a washroom attendant and mostly kept to himself. Joachim opened the door just a few inches. He was wearing a stained undershirt and looked like he had just woken up from a deep, dreamless sleep. Hermann explained the situation with the pipes and asked if Joachim was having any trouble with his drains. The smaller man stared at Hermann with pale, watery eyes that seemed to lack any spark of interest. He shook his head slowly and said that everything was fine in his kitchen. Then he closed the door firmly, leaving Hermann standing in the dim light of the hallway. Hermann went back to his own apartment and tried to use the kitchen sink, but the water there refused to go down as well. He realized that the blockage was not just a local problem. It was something solid and stubborn, lodged deep within the main stack of the building. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. Watching the cars pass by in the shimmering heat, he decided he could not wait for the landlord to act. He picked up the rotary phone and called a local plumber to come out on an emergency Saturday visit. The plumber arrived 2 hours later, carrying a heavy bag of tools and a long, flexible metal snake. He was a large man who grumbled about the heat and the fact that he was missing a football match. Hermann led him to the bathroom, where the dark water had now spilled over the towel and onto the floor. The plumber frowned as he looked at the liquid. He reached down and dipped a gloved finger into the pool, bringing it up to his nose. He did not say anything, but his expression shifted from irritation to a deep, focused concern. He began feeding the metal snake into the drain, turning the handle with a slow, mechanical rhythm. The cable clicked against the sides of the pipe, echoing through the walls of the apartment. After about 10 feet, the snake hit something that felt soft but incredibly dense. The plumber leaned his weight into the tool, trying to force it through the obstruction. Instead of breaking through, the snake seemed to catch on the material. He began to pull the cable back up, hand over hand, as the tension on the line increased. When the end of the snake finally emerged from the toilet, it was dragging a tangled mass of hair and grayish, waterlogged fabric. The plumber laid the mess out on the floor and poked at it with a screwdriver. It was not hair from a head, but something thicker and more matted. As he untangled the fibers, a small, curved object fell out and clattered onto the tile. Herman leaned in to look. It was a fingernail, still attached to a small, jagged piece of bone. The plumber stood up and wiped his hands on his overalls. He told Herman to stay in the room and walked out to his truck to call the police. Herman sat on the edge of his bathtub and stared at the small piece of bone on the floor. The silence in the apartment felt heavy and unnatural. He looked at the wall shared with apartment 4 and realized he could hear a faint, rhythmic bubbling sound coming from the other side. It sounded like a large pot of water reaching a rolling boil. Herman pressed his ear against the thin wallpaper. The bubbling was steady and domestic, the kind of sound that should have been comforting on a Saturday afternoon. He could smell something cooking now. It was a savory, meaty scent that reminded him of a Sunday roast. He thought about Joachim Kroll standing in his cramped kitchen, stirring a pot while the rest of the building's plumbing was choked with human remains. A wave of nausea hit him as he realized the meat in the air and the meat in the pipes were the same thing. The police arrived within 20 minutes, their boots thumping loudly on the wooden stairs. They did not spend much time in Herman's bathroom. After seeing the contents of the pipe, they moved directly into the hallway. 2 officers stood in front of Joachim's door, while a third went to the basement to shut off the water to the entire block. Herman stood in his doorway and watched as the lead detective knocked on apartment 4. There was no answer for a long time, only the sound of the deadbolt sliding back with a slow, metallic click. Joachim Kroll looked confused when he saw the uniforms. He did not try to run or act aggressive. He simply stood there with a wooden spoon in his hand. The officers pushed past him into the kitchen, and Herman saw the detective stop at the stove. On the burner sat a large, dented metal pot. Inside, a thick stew of carrots and potatoes was bubbling. Floating on the surface, among the vegetables, was a small pala hund. It looked like it belonged to a child. The detective turned to Joachim and asked him what he was doing. Joachim looked at the pot and then back at the detective with a calm, almost bored expression. He said that he was just making his lunch because he was hungry. He spoke about the contents of the pot as if they were nothing more than groceries he had picked up at the local market. The police led him out of the apartment in handcuffs, and he did not look back at the stove or the neighbors watching from the hallway. The investigation that followed revealed a horror that the people of Duisburg could not comprehend. Joachim Kroll was not just a strange neighbor with a plumbing problem. He was a predator who had been active for over 20 years. He told the investigators that he viewed people as nothing more than a source of meat. He said that when he was hungry and could not afford a proper meal, he would simply go into the woods or the local parks to find what he needed. He led the police to various sites across the Ruhr Valley, pointing out where he had hidden the pieces of his victims that he could not use. He had murdered at least 14 people, though the true number was likely much higher. His victims ranged from young women to children as young as 4 years old. He had lived in that apartment block for years, sharing the hallways and the plumbing with families who never suspected that a monster was processing his kills just a few feet away. The final victim, the one who had finally broken the pipes, was a 4-year-old girl named Marion Ketter. She had vanished from a local playground only 24 hours before Herman noticed the water rising in his toilet. Kroll had taken her back to his apartment and attempted to dispose of the parts he did not want down the drain. He had done this many times before, but this time, the old iron pipes of the building could not handle the volume. The trial was short and focused on the clinical details of his crimes. Kroll was found to be legally sane. Despite his low intelligence and his complete lack of empathy, He was sentenced to 9 consecutive life terms in prison. The people of West Germany struggled to understand how a man could commit such acts out of a simple, primitive impulse like hunger. He did not have a complex philosophy or a grand plan. He was a hunter of opportunity who saw his neighbors as livestock. Herman Friesen moved out of the apartment block 2 weeks after the arrest. He could not stand the sound of the pipes or the smell of food cooking in the building. He spent the rest of his life living in a small house with its own independent septic system. He never spoke to his neighbors again, and he never invited anyone over for a meal. The memory of the dark water in his bathroom remained with him, a constant reminder that the most terrible secrets are often flowing right beneath the surface. Joachim Kroll died of a heart attack in prison in 1991. He never expressed regret for what he had done and spent his final years as a quiet, model inmate who caused no trouble for the guards. The apartment block on Friesenstrasse was eventually renovated, and new tenants moved into apartment 4. They painted the walls and replaced the old stove, trying to erase the history of the man who once lived there. But some stains do not come out with soap and water. The building stands there today, an ordinary brick structure in a quiet part of the city. At night, when the street is silent and the industry of the valley slows down, you can still hear the water moving through the walls. It is a soft, rhythmic sound that most people ignore as they go about their lives. It is just the sound of a house breathing, but for those who know the history of the Ruhr Valley, every gurgle in the drain sounds like a voice trying to tell a story that no one wants to hear. The case remains a foundational study for criminal psychologists who look at disorganized predators. It proved that evil does not always need a high intelligence or a complex motive to be devastating. Sometimes, it is as simple as a man standing in a silent kitchen, waiting for his lunch to finish cooking. The pot on the stove is gone, and the kitchen is empty. All that remains is the cold, quiet stillness of a room where the truth was finally revealed by a clogged pipe. On January 14th, 1975, Lesley Whittle was lying in her bed in the small village of Hitchhiker, England. The winter wind was rattling the window frames of her family home, a quiet house tucked away in the Shropshire countryside. She had spent the evening studying for her upcoming exams, and her school books were still stacked neatly on the floral-patterned rug near her desk. Lesley was 17 years old, a girl who preferred her books and her privacy to the social whirl of the local teenagers. The house was silent, save for the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Lesley was the daughter of a wealthy businessman who had recently passed away, leaving her a significant inheritance. This financial weight was something she rarely discussed with her friends, as she wanted to be known for her own merits rather than her bank account. She had plans to attend university and was already looking forward to the independence that would come with the spring. Her daily routine was a series of predictable, comforting beats. She would wake at 7, have tea with her mother, and spend the day at school before returning to the sanctuary of her bedroom. She was a meticulous student who often color-coded her notes, a small habit that made her feel in control of her future. That evening, she had fallen asleep with the light still on, a common occurrence during the stress of exam season. Before the house went dark, the physical world of Hitchhiker felt safe and unmovable. The smell of lavender from her pillow and the softness of her duvet were the only things she needed to know. The inheritance was a distant fact of law, not a source of fear. She was a girl who expected her life to follow a straight and logical path from her bedroom to the world beyond. As the clock moved past 1 in the morning, the ordinary peace of the house was broken by a sound that did not belong to the wind. It was the sharp, metallic snap of a window latch being forced open downstairs. Lesley woke instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She sat up in bed and listened, hoping it was just her brother Ronald returning home late or the house settling in the cold. Then, she heard the heavy, deliberate thud of a boot on the carpeted stairs. The sound was too slow to be accidental and too rhythmic to be a family member. Lesley stared at her bedroom door, her breath hitching in her throat. A thin sliver of light from the hallway was suddenly blocked by a shadow that stretched across the floor toward her bed. A man stepped into the room wearing a black hood with roughly cut holes for his eyes. He was carrying a flashlight and a length of white nylon wire. He did not say a word, and he did not look around the room for valuables. He walked directly to Lesley, his movements efficient and practiced, like a soldier on a mission. He grabbed her arm and pulled her from the bed before she could find her voice to scream. The man led her out of the house and into the freezing night air, forcing her into the back of a waiting car. He had left a ransom note on the kitchen table demanding £50,000. But Lesley did not know that yet. All she knew was the smell of damp wool from the man's hood and the terrifying speed at which her life had been dismantled. This was the point of no return, a moment where the safety of her bedroom became a memory. They drove for hours through the dark lanes of the English countryside until they reached a place called Bathpool Park. The man led Lesley into the woods, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the skeletal trees. They stopped at a heavy metal grating on the ground, which the man lifted to reveal a deep, vertical drainage shaft. He forced her onto a ladder and commanded her to climb down into the earth. At the bottom of the shaft, 60 feet below the surface, the air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and stagnant water. The man led her through a series of narrow tunnels until they reached a small ledge overlooking a dark, rushing stream. He looped the nylon wire around her neck and tethered the other end to a metal pipe in the ceiling. He told her that if she stayed quiet and did not move, she would be home soon. The concrete walls were slick with condensation, and the air was so cold that every breath felt like a blade in her lungs. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow drip of water hitting the metal grating nearby. The pressure of the wire against her throat was constant, a thin reminder that she was balanced on the edge of a void. In the absolute darkness, her mind raced back to the floral rug in her bedroom, and she realized with a cold, clear clarity that no amount of money was worth the weight of the silence in this hole. For several weeks, the man returned to the shaft to bring her food and check the wire, but he never spoke to her again. He was Donald Nielsen, a man the British press had dubbed the Black Panther because of his history of high-stakes burglaries and cold-blooded violence. He was playing a game of cat and mouse with the police, using a series of complex ransom drops to lead Lesley's brother Ronald on a wild chase across the country. Ronald Whittle was a man who lived by logic and order, but the instructions left by the kidnapper were designed to break him. He spent nights driving to remote phone booths and leaving suitcases of money in parks, only to find that the kidnapper had never shown up. The police investigation was a chaotic mess of missed signals and radio failures, with different departments failing to share crucial information about the Black Panther's previous crimes. The search eventually centered on Bathpool Park after a local worker found a suspicious car abandoned near the woods. Divers were sent into the lake, and search parties combed the undergrowth. But for a long time, no one thought to look inside the sophisticated drainage system. It was a subterranean maze that was not fully mapped, a perfect hiding place for a man who obsessed over military tactics and survivalism. In March, nearly 2 months after the abduction, a group of investigators finally entered the drainage shafts. They moved slowly through the tunnels with powerful lamps, their voices echoing off the curved walls. When they reached the ledge where Lesley had been kept, they saw a single child's slipper lying on the cold metal grating. It was a small, ordinary object that looked entirely out of place in such a brutal environment. Then, the beam of a flashlight moved upward and caught the white glint of the nylon wire. Lesley was no longer on the ledge. She was hanging from the wire over the dark water of the drainage channel. She had likely fallen or been pushed during one of the man's visits, and the weight of her own body had ended the ordeal. The autopsy revealed that she had died of heart failure brought on by the shock of the fall. The investigation into the Black Panther accelerated with a new, dark energy. Donald Nielsen was eventually captured by 2 brave police officers during a routine patrol after they noticed him acting suspiciously near a sub-post office. When they searched his home, they found the tools of his trade, including the black hoods and the same type of nylon wire used in the drainage shaft. He was a man who had turned his life into a series of calculated strikes, and Lesley Whittle had been his final gamble. Donald Nielsen was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Lesley Whittle, as well as the murders of 3 postmasters during his previous robberies. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, the public learned about the staggering series of police blunders that had allowed the kidnapper to evade capture while Lesley was still alive, just 60 feet below a public park. The drainage shaft in Bathpool Park was eventually sealed with heavy concrete, turning the site of the tragedy into a permanent tomb. The park remains a place where families walk, their dogs and children play, most of them unaware of the concrete labyrinth beneath their feet. The only physical reminder of the case is a small memorial for Lesley, a girl whose life was stolen by a man who saw people as nothing more than leverage. Ronald Whittle spent the rest of his life advocating for better communication between police forces, haunted by the memory of the ransom drops that went nowhere. He kept a single photo of his sister on his desk, an image of her smiling before the inheritance, and the exams and the winter wind changed everything. The silence of the Shropshire countryside was never the same for the family again. The story of the girl in the shaft remains one of the most tragic examples of a life caught in the gears of a predator's cold ambition. It is a reminder that the world we see on the surface is often supported by structures we never think to question until they fail. The darkness of the tunnels and the cold of the wire were the final witnesses to a girl who deserved a spring she never got to see. The cold air of the English tunnels is a world away from the humid, heavy heat of the Pacific. In the heart of a bustling city, another kind of water carries secrets that are just as silent and just as heavy. As the sun sets over the river, a different kind of discovery is waiting in the reeds, where the weight of gold and the precision of a blade tell a story that has no name. In November 1974, Father Ricardo sat on the shaded porch of his small rectory in a coastal village near Barranquilla, Colombia. The air was thick with the scent of salt spray and the heavy, sweet rot of the nearby mangroves. He was a man of 60 who had spent half his life tending to the spiritual needs of families who lived by the rhythm of the tide. Every afternoon, he followed the same routine of polishing the altar silver while the village children played in the dusty square outside. The village was a place where everyone knew the sound of their neighbor's gate and the specific creak of every front door. Ricardo took pride in the fact that his church was the center of this small, interlocking world of trust. He knew which families were struggling with the harvest and which children were due for their first communion. It was a life of quiet service where the greatest scandals usually involved a stray goat or a forgotten feast day. He began his days with a walk to the shore, watching the fishermen launch their boats into the gray light of the Caribbean. He would offer a brief blessing for a safe return and a heavy catch before returning to the church to prepare for the morning mass. His black cassock was faded from the sun, and his hands were calloused from years of maintaining the stone walls of the parish. He expected nothing more from his life than to be the steady hand that guided his people through their ordinary days. The people of the village lived under the constant pressure of the elements and the meager returns of the sea. They relied on their faith to provide the gravity that kept their community from drifting apart during the long, humid summers. Ricardo was the keeper of that gravity, a man who believed that the goodness of his flock was as certain as the rising sun. He saw the world through the lens of a shepherd who knew every sheep in his fold by name. Before the stranger arrived, the environment of the village felt clear and vibrant. Even in the staggering heat, the children would run to the rectory to share a piece of fruit or show off a shell they had found on the beach. Ricardo had a near-future expectation of a quiet retirement, perhaps spending his days teaching the younger boys how to mend nets. He was a man who repeated the same prayers at the same hours, finding comfort in the predictable movement of the liturgical year. A man arrived on the afternoon bus from the city, carrying a single leather suitcase and wearing a crisp, black suit. He introduced himself as Daniel, a traveling missionary who had come to provide spiritual support to the coastal parishes. He had a soft, melodic voice and a gentle way of handling his Bible that immediately put the villagers at ease. Ricardo offered him a guest room and a seat at his table, grateful for the company of a fellow man of God. The stranger spoke of his travels through the high mountains and his desire to bring comfort to the most isolated communities along the coast. He seemed to possess a deep, quiet piety that impressed the local mothers, who brought him water and fresh bread. Ricardo watched the man interact with the village children, noting how he leaned in close to listen to their stories. He looked like a man who had found his true calling in the service of others. At dinner that evening, Ricardo noticed that Daniel did not bow his head when the grace was said before the meal. He held his Bible close to his chest like a precious relic, but he never actually opened the pages to read from them. When Ricardo asked him about his seminary days, the man gave vague, poetic answers that quickly shifted into stories of his childhood. It was a small thing, a brief flicker of inconsistency that Ricardo dismissed as the natural fatigue of a long journey. The next morning, a 10-year-old girl named Maria did not show up for her daily lessons at the church. Her mother came to the rectory in tears, saying that Maria had been seen walking toward the edge of the mangroves with the new visitor. Daniel had told the mother he wanted to show the girl a special spot for a private blessing by the water. Ricardo felt a cold hollow open in his chest as he looked at the empty chair where the man had sat just hours before. The mother explained that the man had looked so official in his suit and so holy with his Bible that she never thought to question his intentions. He had promised to have Maria back in time for lunch, but the hours had passed and the girl had not returned. Ricardo realized with a sickening clarity that he had given a predator the keys to the trust of his entire congregation. He did not waste time with words and immediately called for the village men to gather. Ricardo led several local fishermen into the thick, tangled roots of the mangrove forest where the shadows were deepest. The tide was beginning to rise, pushing the dark, brackish water deep into the narrow channels where the light rarely touched the ground. They called out Maria's name, but the only response was the chatter of tropical birds and the rustle of crabs in the mud. The heat was a physical weight, pressing the sweat into their eyes as they struggled through the muck. The air inside the canopy was stagnant and smelled of sulfur and ancient tesson, decaying wood. Ricardo was waist-deep in the rising silt, the gray mud sucking at his heavy boots with every movement he made. He could hear the distant, mocking ring of the church bells back in the village, a sound that usually brought him peace but now felt like a countdown. I invited this man into my house and I blessed him before he began his hunt. The searchers spread out, moving through the labyrinth of roots that looked like the ribcage of a giant, varied beast. The water was rising faster now, obscuring the small tracks that the girl and the man might have left behind. Every time a branch snapped or a bird took flight, Ricardo's heart leapt with a desperate hope that was quickly replaced by dread. The mangroves felt like a different world, a place where the rules of the village no longer applied. One of the fishermen shouted from a small clearing near a tidal pool that was shielded by thick brush. Ricardo scrambled over a fallen trunk to find the man pointing at a pair of white leather shoes half submerged in the sludge. They were communion shoes, polished and bright, belonging to a girl who had been preparing for her first sacrament. There was no sign of Maria and no sign of the soft-spoken man in the black suit. The tracks in the mud beyond the clearing were confused and led deeper into the impassable swamps where the land dissolved into the sea. Ricardo held the small shoes in his hands and felt the cold reality of the situation settle into his bones. He knew the tides of the mangroves, and he knew that anything taken into the deep channels rarely returned to the shore. He led the men back to the village to contact the authorities in the city. The police in Barranquilla were slow to respond, initially dismissing the disappearance as a tragic drowning in the dangerous coastal tides. They pointed out that many children were lost to the sea every year, and there was no proof of a crime beyond a pair of shoes. But Ricardo would not let the matter rest and began writing letters to every parish along the northern coast. He described the man in the suit and the Bible with a level of detail that only a guilty conscience could produce. Within weeks, he received a response from a priest in a village 300 miles away who described a similar man. This traveling missionary had visited his parish a month earlier, and shortly after he left, 2 young girls had vanished from the local school. A local detective eventually took an interest in the growing list of disappearances and ran the man's description through the National Criminal Archives. They found a file on a man named Daniel Camargo Barbosa. The file indicated that Camargo was a convicted predator who should have been serving a life sentence in a high-security facility. He had been sent to the island prison of Gorgona, known as the Alcatraz of Colombia, because it was surrounded by shark-infested waters and deadly currents. A year earlier, he had vanished during a violent storm, and the prison guards believed he had drowned while trying to swim to the mainland. His body had never been recovered from the sea. In reality, Camargo had built a makeshift raft from driftwood and scraps of plastic, letting the current carry him back to the coast. He had spent the months since his escape moving through small, isolated villages where the people were poor and the trust in the church was absolute. He had crafted a persona as a missionary, using the black suit and the Bible as a form of predatory camouflage. He knew that a man of God would never be questioned by a mother in the countryside. The scale of the horror became clear as more villages reported missing children who had last been seen with a soft-spoken stranger. Camargo was eventually captured in Ecuador after a local girl managed to escape his grasp and lead her father to his hiding place in the brush. When he was interrogated by the police, he spoke with a chilling, detached pride about his methods. He confessed to killing more than 150 girls across 2 different countries. He described the mangroves not as a place of death, but as a vast cathedral where he was the only one who held the power. He had disposed of the bodies in the tidal mud, knowing that the sea and the crabs would erase any evidence of his presence. He viewed his victims as nothing more than a necessary part of his ritual, a darkened version of the faith he used as a weapon. The truth of his crimes was so vast that it redefined the history of South American serial killers. Daniel Camargo was sent to an Ecuadorian prison where he was expected to spend the rest of his life in a small, dark cell. However, to the world he had broken. Eventually caught up to him in 1994 while he was serving his sentence. The nephew of one of his many victims had purposely committed a crime to land in the same prison and waited for the right moment. During a brief period of exercise, the young man approached Camargo and ended his life. The man who had used the word of God to trap the innocent died on a cold concrete floor in the presence of the very grief he had created. He left behind a legacy of fear that stretched across thousands of miles of coastline, forever changing how parents viewed strangers in their midst. The black suit and the Bible were no longer symbols of safety in the coastal villages, but reminders of the monster who had warned them so effectively. Back in the village near Barranquilla, the mangroves still grow thick and impenetrable along the edge of the sea. The local people rarely venture into the deep shadows of the trees anymore, even to gather wood or fish for the evening meal. They say the sulfurous smell of the mud is the heavy memory of the secrets buried beneath the roots. Father Ricardo never replaced the altar silver he had been polishing on the day the stranger arrived on the bus. He eventually left the church and spent his final years sitting on his small porch, watching the bus arrive from the city every afternoon. He would watch every traveler who stepped off, praying for their souls, but never offering them a place at his table again. He was a man who had seen the wolf in the shepherd's clothing, and he knew that the darkness could hide in the brightest of suits. He lived in a silence that was broken only by the sound of the tide. On the altar of the small church, there is now a small glass case that holds a single pair of white leather communion shoes. They are still stained with a faint, gray ring of mud that no amount of cleaning can ever truly remove. They sit there as a silent witness to a girl who believed in a blessing and a man who believed in nothing at all. On Tuesday, November 16th, 1971, Miguel Colon sat in the kitchen of his home on Grand Avenue in Rochester, New York. The late afternoon sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, gray shadows across the linoleum floor. He was nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. His niece, 10-year-old Carmen, was sitting at the small wooden table nearby, focused intently on her schoolwork. The house was filled with the faint, comforting scent of garlic and onions from the evening meal that was simmering on the stove. Miguel watched as Carmen moved her pen across the page of her notebook with a steady, rhythmic hand. She was practicing her cursive, her brow furrowed in concentration as she looped each letter with careful precision. She was a quiet girl who took her responsibilities seriously, and her grades were a source of immense pride for the entire family. Living in the tight-knit Puerto Rican community of Rochester provided a sense of belonging that felt like a protective shield against the cold New York winters. The family moved through their days with a predictable grace, centered around school, work, and the church. Miguel often handled the small errands for the household, but today Carmen had asked if she could walk to the drugstore on her own. She wanted to buy a specific type of shampoo, a small request that felt like a bridge to the independence she was starting to crave. The drugstore was only a few blocks away, a short walk through a neighborhood where everyone knew Carmen by sight. She checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing down her coat and tucking her notebook into her bag. She promised Miguel she would be back in 20 minutes, just in time for dinner. He watched her from the window as she skipped down the front steps, her dark hair bouncing against her shoulders as she disappeared around the corner. Rochester was an industrial city that lived under the weight of the nearby Kodak and Xerox factories. The air often carried a metallic tang from the manufacturing plants, and the sky was frequently a flat, unyielding gray. But inside the house on Grand Avenue, the world felt warm and certain. Miguel expected to hear the front door creak open and the sound of Carmen's shoes on the hardwood floor before his coffee even went cold. 20 minutes passed, and the sun vanished completely, leaving the street illuminated only by the pale amber glow of the street lamps. Miguel walked to the front door and looked out onto the sidewalk, but the pavement was empty. A cold wind began to whip through the trees, rattling the dry leaves that had gathered in the gutters. He told himself she had probably run into a friend or stayed a moment longer to look at the magazines on the rack. He put on his jacket and walked toward the drugstore, his boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that was beginning to form. The shop was still open, the neon sign in the window buzzing with a low, electric frequency. He stepped inside and asked the clerk if he had seen a young girl with dark hair and a yellow coat. The man nodded and said she had been in 10 minutes ago, bought her shampoo, and left through the front door. Miguel walked back toward the house, searching every doorway and alleyway along the route. He found a small, red wool scarf lying on the concrete near the entrance to a narrow service road. It was Carmen's scarf, the one her mother had knitted for her just the week before. The fabric was damp from the evening mist, and it looked small and discarded against the dirty pavement. The logic of a simple delay began to crumble, replaced by a cold and heavy weight in his chest. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, clutching the scarf in his hand while the traffic moved past him on the main road. The headlights of the passing cars looked like predatory eyes, cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing. He realized that the neighborhood he thought he knew was suddenly a landscape of shadows and hidden spaces. I should have walked her to the store myself, he thought, the words repeating in his mind like a funeral bell. Beat 1. The wind was biting into his cheeks, and the grit of the road salt crunched beneath his boots with a dry fall. Hollow sound. Beat 2. He looked down the long, dark stretch of the alleyway and felt the silence of the city tightening around him like a physical grip. Beat 3. If I run fast enough, I can still catch the car that took her. Miguel ran back to the house and called the police, his voice shaking as he described his niece and the red scarf. Within an hour, the quiet street was filled with flashing lights and the sound of barking dogs. The search lasted through the night and into the following morning, with hundreds of volunteers combing the parks and vacant lots of Rochester. Every lead turned out to be a dead end, and every phone call brought only more questions. 2 days later, a cyclist riding through the rural town of Chile, New York, spotted something in a gully near the edge of a cornfield. It was the body of a young girl in a yellow coat. When the investigators arrived, they confirmed it was Carmen Kroll. She had been strangled and her clothing had been disturbed. But the most striking detail was the location itself. Chile was nearly 12 miles away from the drugstore where she was last seen. The police began a massive investigation, interviewing hundreds of people and looking for any connection between Carmen and the town of Chile. They found nothing. There were no witnesses to the abduction and no physical evidence left at the scene other than the body itself. The case began to grow cold, and the fear in Rochester settled into a permanent, low-grade anxiety that changed the way parents looked at their children. Then, in March of 1973, another girl vanished. 11-year-old Wanda Walkowitz was walking home from a grocery store in a different part of the city when she disappeared. Her body was found the next day in the town of Webster. The detectives noted a strange and chilling coincidence. Wanda Walkowitz had been found in Webster. Both her names and the town where she was dumped started with the letter W. They looked back at the first case with a new and terrifying perspective. Carmen Colon had been found in the town of Chile. C. It was not a coincidence. It was a signature. The killer was not just picking victims at random. He was playing a macabre linguistic game, selecting girls whose initials matched the towns where he intended to leave them. This realization turned a local tragedy into a hunt for a serial predator with a specific and obsessive ritual. A third girl named Michelle Maenza disappeared in November of 1973. She was 11 years old and had been seen getting into a car near a shopping plaza. Her body was discovered 2 days later in the town of Macedon. M. The pattern was now undeniable. The Rochester press dubbed the killer the alphabet murderer, and a citywide panic took hold as families with young daughters whose names fit the pattern went into hiding. The investigation moved into a state of high alert, with the police focusing on anyone who had a reason to be traveling between the various towns surrounding Rochester. They looked at delivery drivers, salesmen, and local residents with criminal histories. Miguel Colon became a primary suspect because he was the last family member to see Carmen alive. He was subjected to hours of interrogation and several polygraph tests, but he maintained his innocence throughout the ordeal. Detectives also looked at a local man named Kenneth Bianchi, who worked as an ice cream vendor in Rochester and was later revealed to be one of the hillside stranglers in California. Bianchi had a history of violence and was known to frequent the areas where the girls had disappeared. However, there was no physical evidence to link him to the alphabet murders, and he was never officially charged in the Rochester cases. As the years passed, the investigation stalled. The killer seemed to have vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the 3 sets of matching initials. The files were moved into the cold case unit, and the families of the victims were left to grapple with a grief that had no resolution. Miguel Colon lived under a cloud of suspicion for decades, his name forever linked to the tragedy of his niece. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology allowed the police to re-examine the evidence from the Carmen Colon crime scene. They were able to extract a profile from a sample that had been preserved for 30 years. They tested the DNA against Miguel Colon, and the results were definitive. He was not the killer. After a lifetime of being blamed for the death of the girl he loved, Miguel was finally exonerated by the very science that had not existed when she was taken. The DNA profile was entered into national databases, but it did not produce a match. The killer was either dead, in a prison where his DNA had not been collected, or he was living a quiet life somewhere, having stopped his ritual after the 3rd murder. The alphabet murders remains one of the most famous and baffling unsolved serial cases in American history, a story of a predator who used the map of New York as his own personal game board. Today, the towns of Chile, Webster, and Macedon are quiet suburbs where children play in the yards and people walk their dogs along the rural roads. The cornfields where the bodies were found have mostly been replaced by housing developments and shopping centers. But for the people who lived through the early 70s in Rochester, the letters of the alphabet still carry a weight that has nothing to do with schoolwork or cursive. The school notebook that Carmen had been using on that final afternoon was kept by her family for years. The neat, looped letters on the pages were a testament to a girl who was learning how to communicate with a world that was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The notebook eventually ended up in a box in an attic, the ink fading slowly as the decades marched on. Miguel Colon passed away without ever knowing the identity of the person who took his niece. He spent his final days in a quiet house, far away from the streets of Rochester. He never liked to look at maps, and he never liked to play word games. The silence of the alphabet was the only thing he had left. The linguistic precision of the Rochester killer created a pattern that could be followed on a map. But in the dense redwood forests of Northern California, a different predator was moving through the shadows of the highway. He did not care about names or letters. He only cared about the girls who stood on the side of the road with their thumbs out, looking for a ride into a future that was about to disappear. In February 1972, Detective Butch Carlstedt was driving his patrol car along the winding shoulder of Highway 101 in Santa Rosa, California. The winter rain was coming down in thin, cold sheets that blurred the lines of the redwood trees against the dark sky. He was a man who had spent 15 years patrolling Sonoma County, a place where the air usually smelled of damp earth and ripening grapes. He reached for his thermos of black coffee and took a slow sip, watching the rhythmic sweep of his windshield wipers. The world of Northern California in the early 70s was a landscape of transition and restless energy. Young people from all over the country were flocking to the coast, carrying nothing but backpacks and a belief in the safety of the open road. Hitchhiking was not just a way to get around, it was a social contract. Butch saw them every day, standing at the highway on-ramps with their thumbs out, waiting for a ride from a stranger who shared their sense of freedom. Butch lived in a small house on the edge of town where the morning fog would often linger in the garden until noon. He was a meticulous man who kept his uniform pressed and his boots polished to a high mirror shine. His daily life was governed by the radio calls and the paperwork of a county that was growing faster than the police department could manage. He took pride in being a steady presence for a community that was beginning to feel the first tremors of a changing era. The pressure of the job usually came from the sheer volume of petty thefts and traffic accidents that clogged his weekends. He was a veteran who believed that most people were fundamentally decent, provided they were treated with respect. His near-future expectation was a quiet spring, followed by a fishing trip to the Russian River. He had a habit of checking the mile markers on his route twice, a small rhythmic detail that helped him keep track of the vast, rural geography he was responsible for. Even as the sun began to set, the highway remained a busy artery of movement and light. Butch watched the cars pass by, their headlights cutting through the mist like searching fingers. He expected to finish his shift and return home to a warm meal and the evening news. The environment of the county felt familiar and protective, a patchwork of rolling hills and dense forests that he had known since he was a boy. The first strange detail appeared when Butch was called to a remote ravine near the Franz Valley Road to investigate a report of illegal dumping. He climbed down the steep embankment, his boots sliding on the wet leaves and loose shale, among the scattered trash and rusted cans. He spotted a small glint of gold caught in the roots of a madrone tree. He reached down and picked up a single high school graduation ring, the surface scratched but the gold still bright. He turned the ring over in his hand and noticed the initials etched on the inside of the band. It was a beautiful, heavy piece of jewelry that no one would intentionally throw away with the trash. He put it in an evidence bag, thinking it was likely lost by a teenager during a late-night party in the woods. He did not realize that the ring was the first link in a chain that would eventually pull the entire county into a state of terror. The point of no return arrived 3 weeks later, when a hiker found the body of a young woman in a different ravine 10 miles away. She was nude, and her clothing had been taken from the scene, leaving no immediate way to identify her. When Butch arrived at the site, he felt a cold, mechanical click in his mind as he remembered the ring. This was not a random tragedy or a simple accident. It was the beginning of a predatory cycle. 2 more girls vanished within a month, both of whom had been seen hitchhiking near the Santa Rosa city limits. The fear in the community began to harden into a physical presence that could be felt in every grocery store and gas station. Parents who had once allowed their children to wander freely now kept their doors locked and their porch lights on all night. The free love era of the highway was dying. replaced by a dark and suspicious silence. Butch spent his nights driving the dark stretches of the back roads, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of a white van that witnesses had reported seeing near the disappearance site entrance. He felt the weight of his badge pressing against his chest, a heavy reminder of the girls he had failed to protect. The killer seemed to know the terrain better than the local residents, using the deep ravines and hidden turnouts as a private graveyard. Out, the blinding glare of high beams hit his rearview mirror, washing out the dashboard in a harsh, electric white. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning pale as the car behind him drifted closer, matching his speed exactly on the narrow, shoulderless road. The redwoods towered over the asphalt like ancient, silent judges, their branches weaving a ceiling that blocked out the moon. If he pulls alongside me, I will see his face before I see the flash of a gun. The investigation moved into a colder, more reconstructive phase as the bodies of 7 girls were eventually recovered from the hills. Each crime scene was a masterpiece of grim precision, with the victims placed in specific, almost ritualistic positions. The killer had a clear preference for petite young women with long, dark hair, a detail that suggested a deep and focused obsession. Butch noted that in several cases, the killer had removed a single piece of jewelry or a specific item of clothing as a trophy. A medical examiner pointed out that the way the bodies had been handled suggested a person with a basic knowledge of anatomy or a clinical interest in the human form. This detail led the detectives to look at local hospital staff and medical students, but every lead eventually dissolved into a dead end. The killer was a phantom who operated in the gaps between the patrols, leaving nothing behind but the silence of the forest. The theories began to multiply as the case gained national attention, with some investigators suggesting a link to the Zodiac killer who was active further south. Others thought the crimes matched the pattern of a young man named Ted Bundy who was moving through the Pacific Northwest. Butch followed every tip and interviewed thousands of people, but the Santa Rosa Ripper remained an invisible force that refused to be caught. The twist arrived when a local jeweler came forward with a story about a man who had brought in a high school graduation ring to be resized. The man had claimed the ring belonged to his sister, but he had acted nervous and refused to leave his name when the jeweler asked for identification. Butch realized that the ring he had found in the ravine was not just a discarded object. It was a piece of a collection that the killer was maintaining and grooming. The search for the mystery man in the white van intensified, but the vehicle seemed to vanish whenever the police got close. The killer was mobile, organized, and possessed a level of patience that allowed him to wait for the perfect moment of vulnerability. He was not an impulsive monster. He was a craftsman who viewed the highway as his workshop. The precision of the dumps and the choice of victims pointed to a predator who was in total control of his environment. As the winter of 1973 approached, the murders suddenly stopped. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic arrest, and no confession left behind in a hotel room. The killer simply ceased to exist in Sonoma County, leaving a trail of 7 confirmed victims and dozens of unanswered questions. The investigation remained open, but the energy of the hunt began to fade as the years turned into decades. Butch Carlstedt spent the rest of his career haunted by the faces of the girls who were found in the ravines. He kept the graduation ring in his desk drawer for years, a small and heavy reminder of the truth that was still out there. He eventually retired and moved away from Santa Rosa, but he could never quite escape the sound of the rain on a redwood canopy. He knew that the killer had not been caught. He had only moved on to a different highway. The cases were eventually turned over to the cold case unit, where DNA from the original crime scenes was preserved for future testing. Modern forensic genealogy has cleared several of the original suspects, but the identity of the Santa Rosa Ripper remains one of the greatest mysteries in California history. The free love era is a distant memory now, but the scars on the community are still visible in the way people talk about the old highways. Today, the ravines of Sonoma County are still there, hidden by the thick growth of ferns and blackberries. The wind still rattles the branches of the madrones, and the fog still rolls in from the Pacific to blanket the hills in a gray shroud. The people who live there now drive the same roads and look out at the same trees, unaware of the ghosts that are buried just a few feet below the surface. The high school graduation ring was eventually returned to the family of the girl it belonged to. A small piece of closure in a case that had very little of it. The gold was dull and the initials were worn, but it was still a physical link to a life that was cut short on a rainy night in 1972. It sits in a jewelry box now, a silent witness to a story that has no ending. The silence of the California redwoods is a world away from the frozen, windswept landscapes of the North Atlantic. In a country where violent crime is almost unknown, the disappearance of two men created a void that could only be filled by the stories of the people left behind. As the howling wind beats against the walls of a silent interrogation room, the truth begins to dissolve into a memory that no one can trust. In January 1974, Erla Bolladóttir sat in her small apartment in Hafnarfjörður, Iceland. The winter sun was a rare visitor, appearing for only a few hours a week. Gray light before the North Atlantic darkness returned. Erla was 20 years old and spent most of her time caring for her infant daughter while her boyfriend, Sevar Ciesielski, worked various odd jobs. The apartment was often cold, and the smell of strong coffee and damp wool was the constant background of her life. Iceland was a country where the idea of violent crime felt like a foreign concept. People left their keys in their cars and their front doors unlocked, believing that the small population and the harsh climate created a natural bond of trust. Erla was part of a group of young people who were considered misfits by the conservative society of Reykjavik. They listened to rock music, wore long hair, and lived on the fringes of the working class. Her daily routine was defined by the needs of her child and the unpredictable schedule of her friends. She would spend her mornings walking to the local market and her evenings waiting for Savar to return from the city. She had a habit of keeping a small diary where she noted the weather and the price of milk, a rhythmic task that made her feel grounded. Her hope for the future was simple: a larger apartment and enough money to buy a new coat for the winter. The environment of the small town felt protective and quiet, even during the frequent storms that battered the coast. Erla expected her life to continue in this unremarkable fashion, centered around the growth of her daughter and the occasional weekend party. She lived under the pressure of being a young parent with limited resources, but it was a weight she shared with many others in her circle. The world felt clear and predictable. In late January, a young man named Gudmundur Einarsson went missing after a night of heavy drinking at a community center. He was last seen walking toward the outskirts of town in a heavy snowstorm. His disappearance was strange, but most people assumed he had simply fallen into a crevasse or been swept out to sea. Erla heard about the search on the radio, but she did not think it had anything to do with her or her friends. The first strange detail appeared several months later when the police arrived at her door. They did not come to investigate a crime, but to ask if she remembered seeing Gudmundur on the night he vanished. Erla told them she was at home with her child and knew nothing about the man. The officers were polite, but they looked around her small kitchen with a level of intensity that made her hands shake. They asked specifically about where Savar had been that night. 10 months passed without any sign of Gudmundur, and the case began to fade from the public mind. Then, in November of 1974, a second man named Geirfinnur Einarsson disappeared from a harbor pier in Keflavik. His car was found parked near the water, with the keys still in the ignition. The national panic that followed was unlike anything Iceland had ever seen, and the police were under immense pressure to find a culprit. The point of no return arrived when Erla and Savar were arrested and taken to the Sithumuli prison in Reykjavik. The police did not have a body, a weapon, or a single piece of physical evidence linking them to the missing men. They only had a theory that a group of young criminals had been involved in a smuggling deal gone wrong. Erla was separated from her daughter and placed in a small, windowless cell. The walls of the cell were made of rough concrete that seemed to hum with the vibration of the prison's heating pipes. The air was dry and smelled of industrial cleaner and stale bread. Every time the heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound echoed through her skull like a hammer. She was allowed no contact with the outside world, and her sense of time began to dissolve into a gray blur of isolation. Escalation began when the interrogators started questioning her for 12 hours a day. They told her that Savar had already confessed to the murders and had implicated her as a witness. They used a technique of sensory deprivation, keeping her in solitary confinement and refusing to tell her how long she had been there. Erla began to suffer from a profound lack of sleep, her mind spinning in circles as she tried to remember a night from a year ago. Beat 1. The single light bulb in the ceiling never turned off, casting a harsh, yellow glare on the gray blankets of her cot. Beat 2. The silence of the hallway was so absolute that the sound of her own breathing felt like a scream. Beat 3. If I just tell them what they want to hear, they will let me see my daughter again. The investigation moved into a phase of psychological reconstruction led by a German detective named Karl Schutz. He believed that the suspects were hiding the truth deep in their subconscious and that he had to break them to find it. The police fed Erla small details about the case, and in her exhausted state, she began to incorporate those details into her own memories. She started to believe that she actually had seen a struggle in the dark. This phenomenon was later identified by experts as memory distrust syndrome. Erla and 5 other suspects were subjected to hundreds of days of solitary confinement and were given drugs to help them remember. Under this immense pressure, they all eventually signed confessions describing a complex murder plot. They spoke of bodies being buried in the lava fields and hidden in the sea. Yet the police never found a single trace of either Gudmundur or Geirfinnur. The voice of the court became colder as the trial began in 1977. The prosecution relied entirely on the inconsistent and coerced confessions of the 6 young people. There were no witnesses who could place the suspects at the harbor or the community center. The public wanted a resolution to the fear that had gripped the country, and the court provided it by convicting all of them of murder. The twist did not arrive for another 40 years. In 2018, a commission reopened the case and discovered the extent of the police brutality and the psychological torture used during the interrogations. They found that the suspects had been held in solitary for longer than almost any other prisoners in European history. Most importantly, they realized that the entire narrative of a smuggling ring and a murder plot had been manufactured by the investigators. The High Court of Iceland finally overturned the convictions, exonerating Erla and the others of the crimes they had confessed to decades earlier. The evidence suggested that the 2 missing men had likely died in unrelated accidents, perhaps falling into the sea or dying of exposure in the wilderness. There had never been a murder, and there had never been a conspiracy. There were only 6 people whose lives were destroyed by a system that needed a win. The verdict brought a sense of justice, but it could not return the years that were stolen from the suspects. Savar had died before he could be exonerated, having spent his life trying to prove his innocence. Erla received a large settlement from the government, but she remained a woman whose name was forever linked to the most famous miscarriage of justice in her country's history. The aftershock of the case changed the way the Icelandic police handled interrogations and led to new laws protecting the rights of suspects. The Sithumuli prison was eventually closed, and the lava fields where the bodies were supposed to be buried remained silent. The disappearance of the 2 Einarsons remains a void in the national record, a mystery that was replaced by a different kind of tragedy. The final image of the case is not a crime scene, but an empty car sitting on a pier in the rain. The keys are in the ignition and the door is slightly ajar, as if the owner just stepped away for a second. It is a monument to a night where 2 men vanished and 6 people were taught to remember a lie. The wind off the harbor still carries the same cold salt spray that it did in 1974. The psychological weight of a false memory can trap a person in a cell that has no walls. But in the humid heat of Singapore, a different kind of trap was being set with solid bars of gold. The betrayal there was not born of a confused mind, but of a calculated greed that would lead to a mass grave in the Changi dirt. As the crates are opened, the metallic scent of wealth is the only thing that fills the air. On December 29, 1971, A young man named Liang stood in the back office of a small gold merchant shop on North Bridge Road in Singapore. The midday sun was beating down on the red-tiled roofs outside, sending waves of shimmering heat across the humid pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic, sharp scent of unrefined gold and the rhythmic ticking of a heavy pendulum clock. Liang was 19 years old and spent most of his days weighing small pouches of gold dust for miners and traders who came in from the surrounding islands. The shop was a narrow, deep space where the light from the street only reached the first few rows of display cases. Liang worked for a man named Mr. No, a veteran merchant who was known for his honesty and his ability to spot a counterfeit coin from across the room. Mr. No was a mentor to Liang, teaching him not just the value of the metal, but the importance of the relationships that held the trade together. In Singapore, a man's word was often the only contract that mattered in a high-stakes transaction. Liang's daily life was a series of predictable, grounding movements that made him feel like he was part of something permanent. He would arrive at 8, polish the brass scales until they gleamed, and prepare the heavy ledger for the day's entries. He had a habit of tapping his pen 3 times against the wood of the counter before every transaction, a small, superstitious rhythm that helped him focus. His hope for the future was to one day open his own small brokerage and provide a comfortable life for his aging parents in the kampong. The environment of the shop felt secure and ancient, even as the city around it began to modernize into a global financial hub. Liang expected to finish his shift and join his friends for a bowl of noodles at the hawker center before heading home. He lived under the ordinary pressure of saving enough money for his sister's wedding, a goal that felt attainable as long as the market remained steady. The gold in the safes was not just wealth, it was the foundation of his family's security. A major deal had been brewing for weeks, involving the transfer of 120 kilograms of solid gold bars. This was a massive amount of metal, worth millions of dollars, and it required a level of logistical planning that Liang had never seen before. Mr. No had been coordinating with a trusted business associate named Andrew Cho, an air cargo supervisor who had helped them move smaller shipments in the past. Andrew was a man of high standing who often shared tea with the merchants in the afternoons. The first strange detail appeared when Andrew called the shop to change the meeting place for the final exchange. Instead of the secure office at the airport or the merchant's own back room, Andrew insisted they meet at a quiet residential house in the Changi district. He claimed that the sheer volume of the gold required a more private setting to avoid attracting the attention of customs officials or rival syndicates. Mr. No hesitated for a moment, but his long history with Andrew eventually outweighed his caution. Liang helped load the heavy wooden crates into the back of a nondescript van while the city was still waking up. The weight of the gold made the vehicle's suspension groan as they pulled away from the curb. Mr. No sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on a briefcase containing the final paperwork. He looked at Liang and gave a small, reassuring nod, as if to say that today was the day their hard work would finally pay off. They drove toward Changi, leaving the familiar noise of North Bridge Road behind. The house in Changi was a modest bungalow shielded by high garden walls and thick tropical foliage. It sat at the end of a narrow driveway where the sound of the nearby sea was muffled by the dense humidity. When they arrived, Andrew Chu was waiting for them at the gate, wearing a friendly smile and waving them inside. He directed the van into a large, detached garage that was already half filled with empty shipping crates. This was the point of no return. The moment the gate clicked shut behind them, Liang stepped out of the van and immediately noticed that the garage was unusually cool, as if the concrete had been chilled by an industrial air conditioner. The smell of oil and old wood was overpowering, masking the salt air of the coast. Andrew's brother and several other men stepped out from behind the crates, their movements silent and coordinated. They were not carrying ledgers or scales. They were carrying heavy iron bars and lengths of nylon rope. The ambush was sudden and absolute, leaving no room for negotiation or escape. Before Mr. No could even open his mouth to ask a question, The men swarmed the van with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. Liang felt a heavy blow to the back of his head that sent him sprawling onto the cold concrete floor. He looked up to see his mentor being dragged toward the back of the garage, his eyes wide with a realization that arrived far too late. The air in the garage was thick with the scent of raw exhaust and the metallic tang of fear. Liang felt the rough texture of the concrete against his cheek and the sharp bite of a zip tie tightening around his wrists until his fingers went numb. The pressure of a heavy boot pressed into the small of his back, pinning him to the ground while the shadows of the men moved around him. They are going to kill us for the metal, and no one even knows we are here. The escalation moved with a cold, mechanical speed that left Liang's instinctual mind screaming for a way out. He watched as the men began to systematically execute the merchants and their staff, using the iron bars to ensure the silence was permanent. There was no shouting and no frantic struggle. It was a massacre conducted with the quiet focus of a warehouse inventory. The killers were not angry. They were simply clearing out the witnesses so they could claim the gold. The voice of the city grew distant as the investigation began 48 hours later when the families of the merchants reported them missing. The police initially looked for a hijacking on the highway or a business dispute that had turned violent. They found the abandoned van in a different part of the city, but it was empty and had been scrubbed clean of any fingerprints. The missing 120 kilograms of gold became the center of a national hunt that involved every port and border crossing in Singapore. The breakthrough came when a detective noticed a small discrepancy in the flight logs at the airport where Andrew Chu worked. He had requested a sudden leave of absence on the very day the merchants had vanished. When the police searched his home, they found nothing, but a tip from a neighbor led them to the bungalow in Changi. The officers entered the property with shovels and forensic kits, focusing on a patch of freshly turned earth in a remote corner of the garden. The reconstruction of the crime revealed a death pit that contained the bodies of 10 men, including Mr. Caston, No, and his entire staff. They had been buried in a single mass grave, layered one on top of the other in a desperate attempt to hide the scale of the massacre. The forensic experts noted that the injuries were consistent with a coordinated attack by multiple people using heavy, blunt instruments. The cold-blooded nature of the executions sent a shockwave through the island nation. The twist in the case was the realization that Andrew Chu had been planning the massacre for months. He had used his position of trust and his long-term business relationships to lure the victims into a trap they could not imagine. He did not just want the gold, he wanted to ensure there was no one left alive who could ever testify against him. He had even prepared the grave in the garden before the merchants had even loaded their van on North Bridge Road. Andrew Chu and his accomplices were arrested within a week, caught as they tried to move a portion of the gold bars through a secret channel in the harbor. During the trial, one of the men turned state's witness and described how Andrew had orchestrated every detail of the killings. He spoke about the coldness of the mastermind, who had sat in the house drinking tea while his victims were being murdered in the garage just a few yards away. The climax of the legal proceedings was the largest mass execution in Singapore's modern history. Andrew Cho, his brother, and 5 others were sentenced to death by hanging for their roles in the massacre. They went to the gallows without ever expressing a word of remorse for the lives they had destroyed for the sake of the metal. The case changed the way the gold trade was regulated in the city, ending the era of private, handshake deals in remote locations. The final outcome was the recovery of almost all the stolen gold, which was eventually returned to the families of the victims. But the wealth could not fill the void left by the 10 men who were buried in the Changi dirt. Liang's family received his share of the inheritance, but they never used the money to move out of the kampong. They kept it in a safe, a heavy and silent reminder of the brother who had gone to work one morning and never came home. The aftershock of the gold bar murders remains a staple of Singaporean criminal history, a story of how greed can turn a trusted friend into a monster. The bungalow in Changi was eventually demolished, and the garden where the pit was found is now covered by a modern housing estate. People walk their children past the site every day, unaware of the heavy silence that once occupied that corner of the earth. The gold is back in the safes, but the trust is gone. The final image of the case is a set of brass scales sitting on a dusty counter in an empty shop. They are perfectly balanced, the two pans hanging in a stillness that will never be broken. The metal is polished and bright, reflecting the light from a window that no longer looks out onto a safe world. It is a monument to a trade that was built on a man's word and destroyed by a man's silence. The heavy, metallic thud of gold bars is a sound that lingers in the mind like a debt. But in the lush, historic plazas of Mexico City, a different kind of silence is waiting under the scent of blooming jasmine. A methodical predator is moving through the shadows of the old haciendas, leaving behind a signature that only a sailor or a scout would truly understand. As the red silk scarf catches the light, the beauty of the city begins to feel like a mask. In the early morning hours of June 3rd, 1971, a man named Mateo was pushing his small wooden banca boat into the dark, sluggish waters of the Pasig River in Manila. The air was already thick and humid, clinging to his skin like a wet cloth. He moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, the same movements he had performed every day for 20 years. He was 42 years old, a man whose face was etched with the lines of a life spent under the tropical sun. The Pasig River was the winding, brown artery of the city, carrying everything from mountain silt to the industrial runoff of a growing metropolis. Mateo took pride in his ability to read the water, knowing exactly where the eddies would trap the fish and where the debris would cluster. His daily life was a simple cycle of cast and haul, a struggle to provide for a family of 6 in a city that felt increasingly crowded. He was a man who valued the silence of the pre-dawn hours before the city noise began to roar. His routine was his anchor in a world that felt unpredictable under the weight of martial law. He would wake at 4, drink a cup of strong Barako coffee, and be on the water before the first light hit the spires of the nearby churches. He had a habit of touching the small wooden crucifix tied to his tiller 3 times before he began his work. His near-future hope was to save enough for a new nylon net that wouldn't fray in the heavy river current. The environment of the river felt familiar and almost protective in its constancy. Mateo expected the morning to bring the usual harvest of small fish and perhaps some discarded lumber he could sell for scrap. The pressure of the city's poverty was always there, a heavy gravity that forced him to look for value in everything the river offered. He lived in a small shack near the docks, where the sound of the water against the pilings was his only lullaby. Even as the sky began to turn a bruised purple, the river remained a place of work and necessity. Mateo watched the lights of the Malacañang Palace reflecting in the distance, a reminder of the power and wealth that felt worlds away from his wooden boat. He expected to fill his baskets by noon and be back at the market before the heat became unbearable. The river silt had a specific, sulfurous smell that he had long ago stopped noticing. The first strange detail appeared when he noticed a large wicker laundry basket snagged in a cluster of water hyacinths near the riverbank. It was a high-end basket, the kind used by the wealthy families in the suburbs to transport fine linens. It bobbed gently in the wake of a passing barge, its lid tightly closed and secured with a thick cord. Mateo steered his boat closer, thinking he had found a prize of discarded clothes or perhaps expensive household goods. He reached out with his gaff hook and pulled the basket toward the side of his boat. It was surprisingly heavy, sitting deep in the water as if it contained something dense and sodden. He hauled it onto the deck, the water draining from the wicker in a steady, rhythmic stream. He told himself it was likely just a load of wet laundry that had fallen off a delivery truck or a riverside balcony. Mateo took out his gutting knife and sliced through the cord holding the lid shut. As the tension snapped, a faint, sweet smell rose from the gaps in the wicker, a scent that was distinctly different from the river rot. He hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the top of the basket while the boat drifted further into the center of the channel. The logic of a lucky find was beginning to feel hollow and cold. He flipped the lid open, and the sun hit the contents of the basket with a sudden, blinding glare. Inside, resting on a bed of fine silk, was the head and torso of a young woman. The cuts were so clean and precise they looked like they had been made with a ruler. The light reflected off a heavy gold watch still strapped to her wrist, its second hand ticking away with a mechanical indifference. The boat rocked gently in the swell of a distant freighter, and the heavy scent of river silt seemed to thicken in his lungs. The wicker of the basket was rough against his palms, the dry stalks scratching his skin as the humidity turned the air into a physical weight. He looked at the gold watch and then at the face of the girl, whose eyes were still partially open as if she were about to speak. "If I don't move right now, the river is going to take me down with her." Matteo did not touch the gold or the silk. He simply turned his boat toward the nearest police outpost at the mouth of the river. He moved with a frantic, jerky energy, his previous grace lost to a sudden and overwhelming terror. He realized that finding a body with such expensive jewelry meant this was not a simple robbery. It was a message or a secret that he was never supposed to see. The investigation was handed to Dr. Constantino Núñez, the city's leading forensic expert. When he examined the remains, he was struck by the clinical, almost surgical nature of the dismemberment. The bones had been severed with a medical-grade saw, and the skin showed no signs of tearing or struggle. It was a chop-chop case, a term the Manila press used for the most professional and brutal dismemberments in the city's history. The police began a massive campaign to identify the woman, placing her photo on the front page of every major newspaper. They noted her expensive clothing and the high-end gold watch, assuming a missing person report would arrive within hours from a wealthy family. They checked the social registries and the guest lists of the elite clubs, but no one came forward to claim her. It was as if she had never existed in the world of the living. Detectives looked into the surgical precision of the cuts, interviewing every butcher and medical student in the city. They looked for a secret clinic or a private laboratory where such a time-consuming task could be performed without interruption. But the Manila of 1971 was a place of deep shadows and political secrets. The investigation was quietly hampered by a lack of cooperation from the high society circles the victim clearly belonged to. The voice of the public grew louder as rumors began to circulate that the woman was a secret casualty of a high-level affair. People whispered that she was a mistress or a daughter of the elite who had been silenced to protect a powerful reputation. The gold watch and the tailored dress were clues that pointed to a world of privilege that was currently under the protection of the state. The mystery widened as every lead turned into a dead end. The twist in the case was the realization that there were no missing persons reports in the entire country that fit her description. For a woman of her obvious wealth to vanish without a single family member or friend raised, an alarm was impossible. This meant that the people who knew her were likely the same people who wanted her to stay in that basket. She was an unidentified ghost from a world that had the power to erase its own history. Despite the gold watch and the unique jewelry, the Pasig Jane Doe was never identified. The case became a legend in Manila, a symbol of the dark and clinical violence that could happen behind the closed doors of the powerful. Matteo, the fisherman, never returned to that part of the river, and he eventually sold his boat to work in a warehouse far from the water. He could never shake the image of the ticking watch next to the silent face. The final outcome was a cold file in a police cabinet that was eventually lost during the political upheavals of the following decade. The woman was buried in a nameless grave, her identity as severed as her body. The gold watch was kept in an evidence locker for years, until it too vanished into the bureaucracy of the city. The Pasig River continued to flow, carrying its secrets toward the sea. The aftershock of the discovery changed the way the people of Manila viewed the river, turning it from a source of life into a place of hidden dread. The Chop Chop Lady became a cautionary tale, a reminder that in a city of millions, some people can be disassembled and discarded as easily as laundry. The silence of the elite remained absolute, a wall that even the most clinical investigation could not breach. The final image of the story is a wicker basket caught in the reeds, the lid slightly open and the water rippling through the gaps. The sun reflects off the brown water, creating a glint that looks like gold for a fleeting second. It is a monument to a woman who was found but never seen, and a mystery that the river refused to solve. The current moves on, indifferent to the weight it carries. The humid, silt-heavy air of the Philippines is a world away from the industrial chill of Western Europe. In a place where the pipes are hidden behind brick and mortar, a different kind of blockage was waiting to reveal a secret. As the water begins to back up in a cramped German kitchen, the sound of a bubbling pot is the only warning of the hunger that lives next door. On July 22nd, 1975, a man named Manuel stood at the edge of the Los Galindos estate in the province of Seville, Spain. The afternoon sun was a brutal, white weight that seemed to flatten the landscape of golden wheat. Manuel was a laborer who had worked these fields since he was a boy, and he knew the specific rhythm of the harvest better than he knew the streets of his own village. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a calloused hand and looked toward the farmhouse, expecting to see the usual movement of the midday shift. The estate was a sprawling, ancient property owned by the Marquis of Granina, a man whose family had held the land for generations. It was a place of high stone walls and heavy iron gates that kept the dust of the road away from the colonial architecture of the main house. Manuel usually spent his days on the tractor, moving through the rows of grain in a steady, dusty trance. He took pride in the precision of his rows and the mechanical health of the machines he tended, which were the lifeblood of the local economy. Life on the farm was governed by the demands of the soil and the whims of the wealthy owners, who visited only occasionally from the city. Manuel lived under the constant pressure of a scorching summer that threatened to turn the wheat into tinder before it could be gathered. He had a small family in the village of Paradas, who relied on his weekly wages to keep the pantry full and the children in school. His near-future hope was to finish the harvest early so he could take a few days of rest before the autumn planting began. He followed a strict routine during the harvest, starting his work before the first light and finishing only when the heat became unbearable. He would often stop at the equipment shed to check the fuel levels and ensure the cutting blades were sharp for the afternoon run. Today, he had a small personal detail to attend to. A lucky stone he kept in his pocket that he rubbed every time he started a new section of the field. This small ritual made him feel as if he was in control of a world that was mostly defined by labor and heat. The environment of the farm felt clear and vibrant, even in the staggering temperatures of the afternoon. Manuel expected to see his fellow laborers at the threshing floor, shouting to be heard over the noise of the machinery. He took a long drink from his water skin, the liquid warm and tasting of the leather container. He walked toward the main granary, expecting to find the team preparing the last of the day's yield for transport to the silos in Seville. As he walked toward the equipment shed, he noticed that the heavy agricultural thresher was running at full speed. The engine was roaring with a mechanical ferocity that echoed off the stone walls of the granary and vibrated through the soles of his boots. But the seat of the machine was empty, and there were no workers in sight to manage the flow of the grain. It was a dangerous and wasteful way to leave a piece of expensive equipment in the middle of a workday. Manuel called out for Ramon, the farm manager, but his voice was swallowed by the vibration of the thresher. He walked around the side of the machine, expecting to find someone making a quick repair or perhaps resting in the shade of the hull. Instead, he found a pair of heavy leather boots lying on the ground near the intake blades. They were empty and standing upright, as if their owner had simply stepped out of them and vanished into the heat. He moved toward the farmhouse to find Ramon and saw that the heavy iron gate leading to the main courtyard had been chained from the inside. This was not a standard security measure during the daylight hours when laborers were moving back and forth with supplies. Manuel felt a sharp, cold spike of adrenaline as he looked through the bars and saw a dark, irregular stain spreading across the white gravel of the drive. The ordinary logic of the farm had been replaced by a silence that was louder than the engine of the thresher. The scent of parched wheat and raw gasoline is thick enough to taste on the back of your tongue. The sun beats down on your shoulders with a crushing intensity, while the silence of the courtyard presses against your ears like a physical weight. If I stay here for one more second, the heat will swallow the evidence of my own life. He climbed over the perimeter wall and dropped into the courtyard, his boots crunching loudly on the dry stone. He found Ramon lying near the kitchen door, his head resting at an unnatural angle that no living person could maintain. There was no sign of a struggle, only the clinical finality of the scene. Manuel felt the walls of the estate closing in on him, the high stone barriers that were meant for protection now serving as the boundaries of a trap. He moved with a frantic energy toward the staff quarters, his instinct telling him that he was no longer alone on the property. He found 2 more bodies inside the small, dark rooms, both of them laborers who had been his friends for years. They had been killed with a heavy, blunt object that looked like a piece of the very machinery they were meant to operate. Then he saw the smoke rising from one of the outbuildings near the tractor shed. The smell of burning rubber and kerosene began to drift across the fields, a black smudge against the perfect blue of the Spanish sky. He realized that the killers were still on the property, likely hiding in the very granary he had just passed. He did not wait to find the final victims. He ran for the perimeter wall and did not stop until he reached the main road. He was a man who understood that his world had been broken beyond repair in a single afternoon. The police from Seville arrived hours later, but the investigation was a disaster from the start. Hundreds of curious villagers from Paradas swarmed the estate, trampling over the footprints and moving pieces of evidence before they could be photographed. The officers were overwhelmed by the scale of the massacre and the sheer brutality of the crimes. They found 5 victims in total, each killed in a different location across the property. The forensic team noted that 3 different weapons had been used during the attack on the various victims. 1 person was shot with a shotgun, 2 were beaten with a metal tool, and 2 others were burned beyond recognition in the shed. This variety of methods suggested that the killers were not acting in a fit of rage, but with a coordinated and professional intent. They had moved through the estate with a plan, hitting multiple targets simultaneously to ensure no one could escape. The voice of the authorities grew colder as the weeks passed without a single arrest or a clear motive for the violence. The first theory was that Ramon, the farm manager, had suffered a mental break and murdered his staff before taking his own life. But when the autopsies were completed, it was revealed that Ramon had been the first to die. He had been struck from behind by someone he likely knew and trusted, proving that the manager was a victim rather than a perpetrator. The mystery widened when investigators looked into the financial records of the estate owners and found several inconsistencies. They found evidence of secret accounts and missing funds that pointed toward a much larger conspiracy involving the local elite. There were rumors of a drug deal gone wrong involving the estate's owners and a group of hired enforcers from the city. Every new piece of evidence answered one question but opened 3 more, leading the investigation into a maze of secrets. The twist in the case was the realization that the 3 weapons had been used at the exact same time in different parts of the farm. This confirmed that there were at least 3 killers working in perfect synchronization to trap the victims. It was not a crime of passion or a sudden dispute over wages. It was a professional execution designed to leave no witnesses and no clear path for the police to follow back to the masterminds. The climax of the mystery arrived when the Marquis of Granina was called in for questioning regarding his business associates. He provided a solid alibi, but the shadows of suspicion remained over the estate for decades. The police were never able to find the shotgun or the blunt instrument used in the murders, and the fire in the shed had destroyed any physical evidence of the people who were inside. The truth was burned away, leaving only the charred remains of the staff. The case remains a dark legend in Andalusia, representing a total failure of rural justice during the final months of the Franco regime. No one was ever charged with the murders, and the killers likely lived out the rest of their lives in anonymity. The investigation was eventually closed, and the files were moved to an archive where they gathered dust for 50 years. The people of Paradas never forgot the day the thresher ran empty. The statute of limitations for the crimes expired in the late 90s, ensuring that the killers would never face a courtroom. The Los Galindos estate was sold to a different family who tried to distance the property from its dark history. They repainted the walls and cleared the fields, but the local laborers still refuse to work the land near the equipment shed after the sun goes down. The wheat still grows tall and golden in the summer heat. swaying like a sea of lost memories. The thresher was eventually sold for scrap. The metal melted down and turned into something new and unremarkable. But on the hottest days of July, when the air is still and the cicadas are loud, the farmers say you can still hear the phantom roar of an engine. It is the sound of a machine that never stops, running for people who are no longer there to hear it. The fields hold their secrets well, buried deep beneath the golden stalks and the dry, white earth. On October 6th, 1972, Mary Gibbs stood at the front of her classroom in the tiny township of Faraday, Victoria. The Australian spring sun was streaming through the tall windows of the one-room wooden schoolhouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was 20 years old, a soft-spoken woman who had only recently begun her career as a teacher. She was currently writing a list of vocabulary words on the chalkboard, her hand moving in a steady, practiced rhythm that the children knew to follow. The schoolhouse sat on a lonely stretch of road surrounded by rolling hills and dense stands of eucalyptus trees. Mary took a quiet pride in the isolation of her post, enjoying the way the morning air always smelled of dry grass and peppermint. She had 6 students under her care that day, ranging in age from 5 to 10 years old. They were the children of local farmers, a group of siblings and cousins who treated the schoolroom like an extension of their own living rooms. Mary's daily routine was defined by the simple, grounding tasks of rural education. She would arrive early to sweep the porch, ring the heavy brass bell to start the day, and guide her students through their lessons in reading and arithmetic. She had a habit of checking the wall clock every hour on the hour, a small internal beat that kept the classroom moving forward. Her near-future hope was to organize a small picnic for the children by the nearby creek once the weather turned warmer. The environment of the school felt permanent and protective, a small island of order in the middle of the vast Australian bush. Mary expected the afternoon to bring the usual chatter of the lunch hour and the focused silence of the afternoon study period. She lived under the ordinary pressure of being a young teacher in a remote area, responsible for both the education and the well-being of 6 energetic children. The world outside the wooden walls felt distant and unimportant. Even as the wind picked up and rattled the tin roof of the building, the classroom remained a place of safety. Mary watched as one of her youngest students finished an apple and placed the core neatly on the edge of his desk. She expected to finish the lesson and drive home to her own quiet flat in the neighboring town. The hills around Faraday were beautiful and empty, a landscape she had come to trust over the months she had spent there. The first strange detail appeared when a dirty white van pulled into the dusty turnaround in front of the school. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon, a time when no parents or delivery drivers were expected to arrive. Mary paused with her chalk in midair, listening to the heavy crunch of gravel beneath the tires. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle, both of them wearing dark masks and carrying long, heavy objects wrapped in oily rags. They did not knock or call out a greeting as they approached the porch. They walked with a heavy, coordinated stride that suggested they had practiced this movement many times before. Mary stood in front of her desk, her hands resting on the cool wood as the front door swung open with a violent crash. The men stepped inside, revealing shotguns that looked dark and lethal against the bright sunlight of the classroom. One of the men pointed his weapon at Mary and told her to gather the children and move toward the van. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin and cold. This was the point of no return, a moment where the authority of the teacher was replaced by the raw power of a threat. Mary looked at the terrified faces of her students and realized that their lives now depended entirely on her ability to stay calm. The kidnappers forced the entire class and Mary into the back of the windowless van, slamming the heavy rear doors and locking them from the outside. The interior of the vehicle was pitch black and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial grease. As the engine roared to life, the van began to bounce violently over the unpaved back roads of the Victorian bush. Mary sat on the floor and pulled the smallest children toward her, feeling their small bodies trembling against her side. The van traveled for hours, twisting and turning through a landscape that Mary could no longer see. The heat inside the metal box rose quickly, making it difficult to breathe as the children began to cry in the darkness. Mary realized they were being taken deep into the remote forest, far away from any help or any chance of being spotted by a passing patrol. The men outside were silent, focused only on reaching their destination. The floor of the van is cold and vibrates with a mechanical hum that rattles your teeth. The darkness is so thick you can no longer see your own hands, but you can feel the hot, frantic breath of the child leaning against your shoulder. If I do not find a way to break this lock, we will be buried in the trees before the sun goes down. The escalation moved into a phase of psychological pressure as the van finally stopped in a remote clearing. The men opened the doors briefly to tell Mary that they had demanded a ransom of $1 million for the safe return of the students. They told her that if the money was not delivered by the following morning, they would leave the van where it was and vanish into the hills. Then they locked the doors again and walked away to a nearby camp to wait. The voice of the narrator turns colder as the reconstruction of the escape begins. Mary did not wait for the police or the ransom negotiations to take place. She knew that the kidnappers had no intention of letting them go once they had the money. She began to feel around the dark floor of the van, her fingers searching for any weakness in the metal or the wood. She found a small, jagged piece of steel that had been left behind by a previous owner. Using the metal fragment as a makeshift screwdriver, Mary began to work on the heavy wooden floorboards of the van. She moved with a slow and silent focus, her hands bleeding as she pried at the rusted screws in the absolute darkness. The children watched her in a hushed silence, their eyes adjusting to the faint slivers of light that began to appear through the cracks. She worked for hours, her muscles screaming with fatigue as the night air grew cold outside. The twist in the case was the realization that the kidnappers believed the teacher and the children were too weak to fight back. They had left the van unattended in the belief that the locks in the remote location were enough to hold them. But Mary had managed to remove a section of the floor large enough for a person to squeeze through. She helped each of the 6 children climb through the hole and drop silently onto the grass beneath the vehicle. Once the children were out, Mary followed them, her heart racing as she led the group into the thickest part of the Australian bush. They moved like shadows through the eucalyptus trees, their feet making no sound on the damp leaves. Mary used the stars to keep their direction, heading toward the distant lights of a farmhouse she had spotted earlier in the day. They hid in the ferns whenever they heard the sound of a vehicle or a voice in the distance. They walked for several miles through the rugged terrain until they reached the safety of a local property. The farmer was shocked to find a young woman and 6 small children standing on his porch in the middle of the night, their clothes torn and their faces smudged with dirt. He immediately called the police, who had been searching the entire state for the missing class. The nightmare was over, and every child was returned home without a single physical injury. The investigation into the kidnappers moved quickly once the children provided descriptions of the men and the van. Edwin John Eastwood and his accomplice were captured within 48 hours as they tried to collect the ransom money. Eastwood was a career criminal with an obsession for high-stakes planning, but he had underestimated the resolve of a 20-year-old schoolteacher. He was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the abduction. The final outcome was a national celebration of Mary Gibbs, who was awarded the George Medal for her extraordinary bravery. She returned to teaching, but the tiny schoolhouse in Faraday was eventually closed as the town dwindled in size. The building still stands today, a quiet wooden structure that looks out over the rolling hills of Victoria. It remains a historical site, a monument to a day when a simple lesson in vocabulary was interrupted by a different kind of survival. The aftershock of the kidnapping led to new security protocols for remote schools across Australia. The sense of absolute safety in the bush was replaced by a more cautious and aware community. Mary's students grew up to lead ordinary lives, but they never forgot the teacher who had led them through the floorboards of a dark van. The wooden boards were eventually replaced, but the story remained etched into the history of the town. The final image of the story is an empty desk in a one-room schoolhouse with a half-eaten apple sitting on the corner. The sun is setting behind the hills, casting a long shadow across the floor where a hole once existed. It is a reminder that the greatest heroes are often found in the most ordinary places, doing the most ordinary jobs. The bell in the schoolhouse is silent now, but the echo of the escape still lingers in the air. The heroic silence of the Australian bush is a world away from the crowded courtrooms of Indonesia. In a city where the luxury cars of the elite reflect the bright tropical sun, a different kind of injustice was being prepared for a young woman who only wanted to sell her goods. As the cold lights of the courtroom flicker, the bravery of one girl is about to challenge a system that believed she was invisible. In September 1970, Sumaria walked through the narrow, crowded streets of Yogyakarta, Indonesia. The late afternoon air was heavy and humid, smelling of damp earth and the sweet smoke of clove cigarettes from the nearby food stalls. She was 18 years old and carried a heavy wicker basket filled with fresh eggs, balanced carefully against her hip with a steady, practiced ease. Sumaria was known to everyone in her neighborhood as Sum Kuning, a nickname that meant yellow sum. She wore a simple batik shawl wrapped around her shoulders to protect her from the sudden, violent tropical downpours that marked the end of the dry season. Her life was defined by the rhythm of the local market, where she spent her long days selling eggs to help her mother pay for their small, wooden home. She had a habit of counting her remaining eggs 3 times before heading home at sunset, ensuring every cent was accounted for. Every bit of profit she earned was tucked into a small cloth pouch hidden securely in the folds of her sarong. She hoped to save enough to eventually buy a new bicycle so she could reach the further villages where the market prices were slightly better. The city of Yogyakarta felt like a safe and familiar world where the sounds of gamelan music drifted through the air from the nearby palace grounds. Sumaria expected to finish her final route and be home in time to help her mother prepare the evening meal of rice and vegetables. The pressure of their poverty was a constant, heavyweight, but it was a burden they carried with a quiet and steady dignity. As she reached the quiet outskirts of the city, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, and the rain began to fall in heavy, warm sheets. The streets were quickly emptied of pedestrians as people ducked under the eaves of the small shops to wait out the passing storm. Sumaria kept walking, her head bowed against the wind, trying her best to keep her basket of eggs dry under her shawl. The first strange detail appeared when a black luxury car slowed down and pulled alongside her on the deserted, mud-slicked road. It was a vehicle that did not belong in her neighborhood, with polished chrome and tinted windows that reflected the gray, flickering light of the storm. The driver rolled down the window just an inch and asked her if she needed a ride to the next major crossroads. There were 4 young men inside the car, all of them dressed in expensive, crisp shirts that marked them as children of the city's wealthy elite. They spoke with a polite and friendly tone, offering her a seat in the back where it was dry and comfortably warm. Sumaria hesitated for a moment, looking at the heavy rain and then at the inviting, open door of the vehicle. She stepped into the car and felt the soft, cool leather of the seats against her damp skin for the first time in her life. The smell of expensive tobacco and air conditioning was overwhelming, a scent that belonged to a world she only ever saw from a distance. The door shut with a solid, expensive thud that seemed to instantly cut off the sound of the falling rain. The car did not turn toward the crossroads as the driver had originally promised her it would. Instead, it accelerated quickly away from the city center and headed toward a dark and isolated stretch of forest near the edge of town. Sumaria asked them to stop, her voice rising with a sudden and sharp realization that the logic of the ride had changed. The man in the passenger seat turned around and told her to be quiet, his face no longer friendly but cold and bored. He did not look at her as a person, but as an object that had been picked up on the side of the road for sport. This was the point of no return, a moment where the safety of the street vanished into the dark shadows of the car. They drove deep into the trees and stopped in a small clearing where the only sound was the rhythmic, hollow tapping of the rain on the roof. The men forced her out of the car and into the thick mud. Ignoring her frantic pleas and her attempts to crawl away toward the brush, they acted with a sense of total impunity, as if they knew the rules of the city did not apply to them. When they were finished, they left her on the side of the muddy road and drove away, the luxury car disappearing into the gray mist like a ghost. Maria lay in the dirt for a long time, the rain slowly washing the blood and the grime from her face and her torn clothes. She eventually found the strength to walk to a nearby police station to report what had happened to her. She expected the officers to help her, but the atmosphere inside the station was cold and suspicious from the moment she walked through the door. They looked at her torn batik and her bruised face with a level of contempt that she did not immediately understand. They asked her if she had been drinking or if she had done something to provoke the men in the car. The investigation took a sinister turn when the police realized that the primary suspects were the sons of high-ranking military and police officials. Instead of searching for the black luxury car, the authorities began to search for ways to discredit Maria and protect the families. They claimed she was a communist provocateur who was making up the story specifically to embarrass the government. The cold light of the interrogation room reflected off the polished, pitted surface of the metal table between them. The officer leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes as he accused her of lying about her own physical pain. If I stay silent now and let them tell my story for me, she thought, then they will win a second time. Maria was arrested and put on trial for perjury, facing a long prison sentence for reporting the very crime that had been committed against her. The national press picked up the story, and a wave of public outrage began to spread across the islands of Indonesia. People saw her not as a criminal or a liar, but as a symbol of the rot hidden behind the luxury of the elite. The voice of the court grew colder as the prosecution presented a series of fabricated witnesses and documents during the long hearings. They tried to prove that Maria had never even been in a car that night and that her many injuries were entirely self-inflicted. The logic of the state was to protect the powerful at any cost, regardless of the physical truth of the girl's body. The national police chief, a man named Hogeng Iman Santoso, attempted to investigate the case honestly and find the owners of the car. He was known for his legendary integrity and his refusal to accept the bribes that were common among the military officials of the era. However, before he could bring the real suspects to justice, he was abruptly removed from his post and forced into retirement. The trial eventually moved to a small, packed courtroom in Yogyakarta, where a judge named Budiman Taruna was assigned to hear the final arguments. He was a man who had spent his entire life studying the law and believed that justice should be blind to the rank of the accused. He listened to the prosecution's repetitive arguments with a quiet and focused intensity that made the military observers in the room nervous. The first theory presented was that Maria had been paid by a political group to stage the assault and create a public scandal for the police. This version of events relied on the idea that an 18-year-old egg seller could coordinate a national conspiracy from a muddy roadside. Each new witness for the prosecution seemed to answer one question while opening a dozen new gaps in their own logic. The twist in the case arrived when Judge Taruna began to ask his own sharp questions of the police witnesses who had handled the initial report. He pointed out the massive inconsistencies in their written records and the total lack of any evidence to support the claim of political agitation. He realized that the entire case against Maria had been built on a foundation of professional intimidation and systemic lies. Despite the very real threats against his own life and his judicial career, the judge reached a verdict that shocked the entire nation. He acquitted Maria of all charges and stated clearly that the evidence against her was entirely and maliciously manufactured. He did not have the power to arrest the protected sons of the officials, but he had the power to give the victim her name back. The final outcome was a legal victory for Maria, but the men who had actually attacked her were never brought to a trial of their own. They remained in the comfortable shadows of their family's power, protected by a system that valued the status of the father over the life of the girl. Maria returned to her mother's home, but she was no longer just an egg seller. She was a national hero. The aftershock of the Kuning case sparked a movement for judicial reform that lasted for years across the country of Indonesia. It exposed the deep corruption within the police and the military during the New Order era, leading to a new wave of social activism. Maria lived out the rest of her life in Yogyakarta, a woman who had faced the elite and refused to blink. The final image of the case is a small and torn batik shawl sitting on a shelf in a quiet, sunlit room in a village house. It is a simple piece of patterned cloth, but it holds the heavy memory of a rainy night and a girl who fought for the simple truth. The city of Yogyakarta continues to move around it, a place of music and light that still remembers the egg seller. The courageous silence of the Indonesian court is a world away from the vibrating, mechanical hum of a crowded city bus. In the heart of Bangkok, a different kind of mystery was waiting at the end of a long and humid evening route. As the red bus pulls into the dark depot, the sound of the idling engine is the only thing that fills the empty parking lot. In November 1972, Somsak leaned against the vibrating metal frame of the rear door as his bus rumbled through the neon-lit streets of Bangkok. The air was a thick, humid soup that carried the scent of street food, stagnant water, and the constant, heavy smell of diesel exhaust. Somsak was 24 years old and spent his nights navigating the chaotic arteries of the city as a bus conductor. He held a long metal cylinder in his right hand, snapping the lid open and shut with a sharp, rhythmic click that signaled he was ready to collect fares. The red bus was a rolling piece of industrial history, its wooden floorboards worn smooth by the feet of thousands of daily commuters. Somsak moved through the aisle with the balance of a sailor, weaving between passengers who were clinging to the overhead handrails. His daily life was a series of loud, repetitive motions that defined the boundary between work and home. He took pride in his ability to remember every face that boarded his bus and exactly which stop they had paid for. Working the late shift provided a specific kind of gravity to his life that the daytime conductors never understood. He saw the city when the heat had settled into a low, simmering pressure, and the people were exhausted from the long hours of the tropical sun. Somsak lived in a small room above a repair shop where the sound of engines was his only music. His near-future hope was to save enough money to buy a small piece of land in his home province where the air was clear. Somsak had a habit of checking the coins in his collection tube 3 times after every major stop, ensuring the count was perfect before the next wave of passengers arrived. This small, personal detail was his way of maintaining order in a city that felt increasingly lawless and crowded. He was a man who believed that if you took care of the small things, the big things would take care of themselves. He expected the night to end like every other, with a cold meal and a few hours of dreamless sleep. The environment of the bus felt familiar and almost protective as it moved through the dark stretches of the city outskirts. Somsak expected the passengers to thin out as they reached the final depot, leaving only the smell of old upholstery and the hum of the idling engine. He lived under the ordinary pressure of a quota he had to meet for the bus company, a weight that kept him focused on the snapping lid of his coin tube. The world outside the windows was a blur of shadows and flickering street lamps. A young woman boarded the bus near the university, carrying a stack of books tied together with a simple piece of twine. She was roughly 20 years old and wore the modest, white and black uniform of a student. She paid her fare without looking up and moved toward the back of the bus. Taking a seat in the very last row, Somsak noted the time and the stop, snapping his metal tube shut with a final brown, satisfying click before moving back to the front. The first strange detail appeared when the bus reached the final depot at the end of the line, miles away from the university district. The driver cut the engine, and the sudden silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight in the small space. Somsak stood up and looked down the aisle, expecting to see the girl gathering her books to disembark. Instead, she was still sitting in the back row, her head slumped forward against her chest as if she had fallen into a deep sleep. Somsak walked down the center of the bus, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards in the absolute stillness of the parking lot. He called out to her, telling her that the route was over and she needed to wake up. She did not move, and she did not respond to the sound of his voice. He reached out to tap her on the shoulder, his hand hovering in the dim, yellow light of the overhead lamp. The logic of a tired student was beginning to feel hollow and wrong. The smell of diesel exhaust is thick enough to coat the back of your throat while the vibration of the idling engine suddenly dies away. The humidity in the bus turns into a cold, wet pressure that settles on your skin like a layer of oil. If I touch her and her skin is cold, the floor beneath my feet is going to disappear. Somsak reached out and touched the girl's shoulder, and her body tilted slowly toward the window without any resistance. He pulled his hand back and saw that his fingers were wet with something warm and dark. He looked down at her white blouse and realized it was saturated with blood from a single, quiet wound in her side. He did not scream. He simply backed away until he hit the metal frame of the rear door. The driver came to the back of the bus to see what was taking so long and found Somsak standing in a state of shock. They were alone in the dark depot, surrounded by rows of empty red buses that looked like silent, resting beasts. This was the point of no return, a moment where a routine commute turned into a locked room mystery on wheels. They realized that the girl had been killed while the bus was moving, surrounded by other passengers who saw and heard nothing. The investigation began within the hour as the police cordoned off the bus and began interviewing the staff. The voice of the detectives was cold and reconstructive, focusing on the timeline of the final leg of the route. They realized that the bus had been crowded when the girl boarded, but no one had reported a struggle or a scream. The murder had been committed with a small, thin blade that left almost no trail and was never recovered from the vehicle. The first theory was that Somsak or the driver had committed the crime during a quiet moment of the route. The police subjected them to hours of interrogation, looking for inconsistencies in their stories or a motive that didn't exist. They checked their clothing for blood and searched their lockers at the depot, but they found nothing that linked them to the student. The bus staff were just as confused and terrified as the rest of the city. A second theory emerged involving a mystery passenger who had been seen sitting directly behind the girl for several stops. Witnesses at earlier locations remembered a man who kept his face turned toward the window and never spoke to the conductor. But because the bus was crowded and the lighting was poor, no one could provide a clear description of his features. He had simply vanished at one of the mid-route stops, leaving the girl to bleed out in silence. The twist in the case was the realization that the murder was physically impossible to perform without being noticed by the people sitting right next to her. The blade had to have been pushed through the gap in the seats with a level of precision that suggested a professional or a shadow. The earlier signs of the man sitting behind her took on a new, darker meaning. He had waited for the exact moment when the bus hit a bump or the engine roared to deliver the fatal strike. Despite a massive public outcry and a citywide search for the mystery passenger, the case remained unsolved. The police were never able to find a weapon or a suspect with a clear connection to the university student. She was a girl with no enemies and no secrets, a random victim of an urban phantom who knew how to blend into the background. The red bus was eventually returned to service, but the seat in the back row remained empty for a long time. The final outcome was a cold file in the Bangkok archives that eventually became the basis for a local urban legend. The story of the red bus murder was told to every new conductor as a warning about the dangers of the night shift. Somsak eventually quit his job and moved back to his home province. Unable to stand the sound of the metal fare tube, he never rode a public bus again, preferring to walk even when the heat was at its worst. The aftershock of the murder led to new lighting requirements for city buses and a temporary increase in police patrols on the late-night routes. But the sense of safety in the public space had been permanently broken. People began to sit with their backs against the walls and their eyes on the people around them. The ghost bus became a symbol of a crime that was committed in plain sight and yet remained completely invisible. The final image of the case is a red bus parked under a single flickering street lamp at the end of its route. The engine is off and the doors are open, but the interior is a void of shadows and silence. The smell of diesel exhaust still lingers in the air, a faint and heavy reminder of a night when a life was taken without a sound. The city moves on around the depot, but the bus stays still. The silent mystery of the Bangkok streets is a world away from the high-security hotels of southern Africa. In a city where the doors are bolted and the porters are always watching, a different kind of disappearance was waiting in a locked room. As the maid turns the master key and steps into the quiet suite, The smell of lavender perfume is the only thing that remains. On a Tuesday morning in May 1972, Sarah was pushing her heavy laundry cart down the carpeted hallway of the fourth floor of the President Hotel in Johannesburg. The autumn air outside was crisp and dry, but the interior of the hotel was warm and smelled of lemon wax and expensive tobacco. Sarah was 34 years old and had spent the last 6 years maintaining the rooms of the city's most prestigious urban fortress. She moved with a rhythmic efficiency, stopping at every door to check for laundry bags. The hotel was a high-security environment located in the heart of a city that was growing faster than the infrastructure could support. Sarah liked the quiet predictability of the morning shift when the halls were empty of guests and the only sound was the muffled hum of the vacuum cleaners. She had a habit of checking her reflection in the polished brass of the fire extinguishers as she passed them, a small ritual that made her feel present in the long, identical corridors. She took pride in her work and was known for her attention to the smallest details. Sarah lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city and relied on her steady wages to support her young daughter. The pressure of the city's rapid expansion was a constant weight on her mind, making her value the stability of her position at the hotel. She had a near-future expectation of attending her daughter's school play later that week and was already looking forward to the break in her routine. She expected the morning to proceed without any interruption to her schedule. The environment of the hotel felt secure and ancient, a place where the doors were thick and the locks were made of heavy, solid brass. Sarah expected to find the rooms empty as the guests headed out for business meetings or sightseeing tours in the historic district. She lived under the ordinary pressure of a strict cleaning quota that required her to finish 12 rooms before the lunch hour began. The world inside the President Hotel was a sanctuary of order and high-end comfort. Sarah reached room 412 at exactly 8 in the morning and noticed that the Do Not Disturb sign had been removed from the handle. The guest was a British traveler named Gertrude Lithgow, who had arrived 3 days earlier for a solo vacation. Sarah knocked twice on the heavy wooden door and called out a polite greeting, but there was no response from inside the suite. She waited for a moment, listening for the sound of a television or a shower, but the silence remained absolute. The first strange detail appeared when Sarah tried to use her master key to open the door and found that it would only move about an inch. The heavy brass security bolt had been engaged from the inside, which meant that Gertrude had to be in the room. Sarah called out again, her voice echoing in the small gap between the door and the frame. She felt a slight prickle of unease as she looked into the sliver of darkness and saw that the lights in the room were turned off. She went to the end of the hallway and used the service phone to call the night manager, explaining that the guest in room 412 was not answering. The manager arrived a few minutes later with a set of specialized tools designed to bypass the interior bolt in case of an emergency. He worked on the lock with a slow and focused energy, the metal clicking softly in the quiet hallway. This was the point of no return, a moment where the privacy of the guest was about to be officially breached. When the manager finally pushed the door open, the air in the room was still and carried the faint, fading scent of lavender perfume. The bed was neatly made, but the sheets had been pulled back as if someone had recently been sleeping there. Sarah stepped into the room and noticed a room service tray sitting on the desk with a half-eaten meal of roast chicken and vegetables. A glass of water was still half full, and a silver fork rested on the edge of the plate. The morning sun was cutting through the heavy velvet curtains in narrow, golden shafts that illuminated the dust floating in the air. The silence in the suite was so thick that the sound of the manager's watch felt like a hammer hitting an anvil against Sarah's ears. The pressure of the empty space seemed to tighten around her throat as she looked at the untouched luggage sitting by the wardrobe. If she is not in this room right now, then she is nowhere in this world. The manager checked the bathroom and the small dressing area, but both spaces were completely empty. Gertrude's shoes were lined up neatly by the bed, and her coat was still hanging on the hook behind the door. Her passport, her purse, and a significant amount of cash were sitting on the nightstand, untouched and exactly where she would have left them. There was no sign of a struggle and no indication that anyone else had been in the room. The Johannesburg police arrived within the hour and treated the suite as a high-priority missing persons case. They searched every inch of the floor and the ceiling, looking for any hidden compartments or signs of a forced entry. The voice of the lead detective was cold and reconstructive as he noted the placement of every item in the room. They checked the ventilation shafts and the service corridors that ran behind the walls, but they found no trace of the British traveler. The investigation centered on the night porter who had been stationed at the desk near the elevators for the entire shift. He swore on his life that he had seen Gertrude enter her room at 10 in the evening and that the hallway had been empty until Sarah arrived. He had a clear view of the only entrance to the 4th floor and was certain that no one had passed his desk. The detectives cross-referenced his story with the early security logs from the lobby. The lobby cameras showed the main entrance was empty, and the street outside was quiet during the hours between midnight and 6 in the morning. There was no footage of anyone resembling Gertrude Lithgow leaving the building, and no one was seen entering the 4th floor hallway. The hotel was a sealed box, and room 412 was a smaller, more secure box inside of it. The investigators realized they were looking at a physical impossibility. The detectives realized that the windows in the room were made of heavy safety glass and were sealed shut to maintain the climate control of the building. They could only be opened with a special key held by the maintenance department, and the locks on the windows were still intact. Gertrude had bolted herself inside a room that had no other exits and had then simply vanished into thin air. There were no footprints on the carpet and no DNA evidence that belonged to a stranger. The twist in the case was the realization that the bolt was fully engaged when Sarah first tried the door. This confirmed that the disappearance happened while the room was locked from the inside, leaving the occupant with no way to exit and then relock the door. The investigators were left with a series of theories involving secret passages that did not exist or a voluntary disappearance that had no logical path. The mystery of the invisible woman became a permanent fixture of Johannesburg folklore. Despite a massive citywide search and an international inquiry that involved Scotland Yard, Gertrude Lithgow was never found. Her family in the United Kingdom never received a single phone call or a ransom demand, and her bank accounts remained untouched for decades. She had no history of mental illness and no reason to vanish from her own life in a foreign country. The case was eventually moved to the Cold File Unit of the South African Police Services. The final outcome was the preservation of her belongings in a police warehouse, where they remained in a wooden crate for 50 years. Her shoes, her passport, and her half-eaten meal were the only witnesses to a night that defied every rule of physical logic. The hotel eventually replaced the locks on the 4th floor and returned room 412 to the guest inventory. Sarah continued to work at the hotel, but she always walked past that specific door a little faster. The aftershock of the disappearance changed the way the hotel handled guest security and led to a new system of electronic key cards. But the sense of absolute safety in the locked rooms was gone, replaced by a lingering and quiet dread. People began to check the bolts on their doors twice and leave the lights on in the hallways. The President Hotel remained a place of luxury, but it was also a place that held a secret it could not explain. The final image of the case is a dinner plate with a cold meal sitting on a desk in a quiet room. The sun is setting behind the city skyline, casting a long and dark shadow across the carpet where a guest once stood. It is a reminder that some people can step into a room and never step back out. The silence of the suite is the only thing that remains. The empty silence of a locked hotel room is a world away from the lush, historic plazas of Mexico City. In a place where the shadows of old haciendas hide a different kind of predator, a red silk scarf is about to become a signature of death. The beauty of the blooming jasmine is masking a darkness that is moving closer with every step. On a cool morning in March 1970, Captain Sanchez was walking through the Centenario Garden in the heart of Coyoacan. The air was crisp and carried the heavy, sweet scent of blooming jasmine that climbed the stone walls of the nearby haciendas. He was a man of 50, with graying temples and a steady, measured gait that commanded respect from the local shopkeepers. He stopped briefly to adjust the collar of his coat, watching a group of artists set up their easels near the central fountain. Coyoacán was a place of intellectual energy and historic beauty, a bohemian sanctuary where the elite and the creative lived in a quiet, protected peace. Sanchez had patrolled these cobblestone streets for 20 years and knew every narrow alleyway and hidden courtyard in the district. He took a personal pride in the safety of this neighborhood, believing it to be a world apart from the chaotic sprawl of the rest of Mexico City. He saw himself as the guardian of a culture that was as fragile as it was ancient. His daily routine was a series of predictable and comforting beats that anchored him to the community he served. He would begin his shift with a strong coffee at a small cafe near the church, followed by a long walk through the various plazas to check in with the night watchman. He had a habit of stopping at the old Naval Academy gates twice every morning to inspect the heavy iron locks. He was a veteran who believed that the small details of security were the only things preventing the modern world from encroaching on the past. The pressure of the job usually came from the high expectations of the residents, who demanded a level of order that was rare in the 1970s. Sanchez lived with the constant responsibility of maintaining a safe zone in a city that was beginning to see a rise in political unrest and street crime. He had a near-future expectation of attending a gallery opening for a friend later that evening. He was a man who appreciated the quiet, civilized life that Coyoacán offered to those who respected its boundaries. Even as the morning sun began to warm the colorful facades of the houses, the garden remained a place of tranquility and order. Sanchez watched a pair of pigeons landing on the rim of the fountain, their wings splashing in the clear water. He expected to finish his rounds and spend the afternoon reviewing permit applications at the station house. The environment of the district felt familiar and unshakable, a landscape of lush greenery and colonial architecture that he had come to trust with his life. The first strange detail appeared when he reached a stone bench near the edge of a thick grove of bougainvillea. Draped over the back of the bench was a long, red silk scarf that fluttered gently in the morning breeze. It was a distinctive and expensive item that looked as if it had been placed there specifically to catch the light. Sanchez approached the bench, thinking that a local woman had forgotten it during an evening stroll in the plaza. He reached out to pick up the scarf and noticed that it was tied to the iron framework of the bench with an intricate and unusual knot. He leaned in closer, his professional curiosity piqued by the complexity of the loops and the tightness of the cord. It was a knot that required a specific type of training, something he had only seen in the Naval Academy or among master sailors. He felt a slight chill as he realized the scarf was not forgotten. It was a display. He walked behind the bench to see if the owner was nearby and saw a pair of shoes protruding from the thick shadows of the bougainvillea. He pushed the flowering branches aside and found the body of a young woman lying in the damp grass. She had been strangled, and her face was turned toward the church as if she were in the middle of a prayer. The red silk scarf was the only vibrant color in a scene that was suddenly and violently gray. The scent of jasmine is so thick it feels like a physical weight in your lungs, while the cold moisture of the grass seeps through your boots. The narrow cobblestone streets and the high, windowless walls of the haciendas seemed to lean inward, turning the open plaza into a suffocating trap. He is here, right in front of me, and I am looking at a knot he tied while I slept. Sanchez did not touch the body or the scarf. He blew his whistle to alert the nearby patrolmen and stood guard over the site. Within the hour, the tranquil garden was filled with the sound of sirens and the frantic energy of a crime scene investigation. This was the point of no return for Coyoacán, a moment where the bohemian sanctuary became a hunting ground. The local residents watched from behind their heavy wooden doors, their sense of safety shattered by a red silk signature. The investigation into the strangler of Coyoacán began with a cold and clinical focus on the specific knots used in the murder. Sanchez worked with the city's lead forensic team to analyze the way the scarf had been tied and the pressure points on the victim's neck. They realized that the killer was methodical and possessed a high level of technical skill. He was not an impulsive predator. He was a craftsman who treated his crimes with the same precision as a sailor rigging a ship. A second victim was found 3 months later in the Viveros Park. a lush forest area that was popular with morning joggers. She had been strangled with a similar silk scarf, and the body had been posed in a way that suggested a ritualistic obsession with the local history. The media dubbed the killer El Estrangulador, and a moral panic took hold of the city. People began to avoid the parks and plazas after dark, and the bohemian energy of the district was replaced by a heavy, suspicious silence. The first theory pursued by the police involved a local eccentric known as the Poet, who was often seen wandering the plazas at night. He was a man who wrote dark, romantic verses and was known to carry long pieces of string that he would knot and unknot as he walked. Sanchez interviewed the man for hours, looking for a connection to the Naval Academy or a background in the military. But the poet's knots were messy and chaotic, lacking the surgical precision of the killer's work. A second theory emerged when a witness reported seeing a man in a navy blue uniform near the site of the second murder. The police began to investigate current and former students of the Naval Academy, focusing on those who lived within walking distance of Coyoacán. They looked at academic records and disciplinary files, searching for a man who possessed the specific combination of technical skill and psychological instability. Sanchez spent his nights reviewing thousands of personnel files in a cold, dim basement. The twist in the case arrived when the police arrested a local resident who worked as a set designer for a theater company in the city. He was a man who had a professional knowledge of ropes and knots and had access to high-end silk fabrics through his work. When they searched his home, they found a collection of scarves and a notebook filled with drawings of the Coyoacán plazas. It seemed as if the mystery of the strangler had finally been solved. The suspect was subjected to a high-profile trial that became a sensation in the Mexican press. The prosecution presented the scarves and the sketches as definitive proof of his guilt, and the public was eager for a conviction. However, during the cross-examination, a naval expert pointed out that the knots found on the victims were tied with a left-handed bias. The suspect was right-handed and possessed a different technical rhythm that made it impossible for him to have committed the crimes. The court was forced to acquit the man due to a lack of physical evidence, leaving the investigation in a state of total collapse. Sanchez realized that the real strangler was still out there, likely watching the trial from the gallery. The killer was someone who had enough knowledge to mimic a naval knot, but possessed a biological trait that the police had overlooked. The predator had used the cultural background of the city to create a diversion that led the investigators in the wrong direction. The murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and no further victims were found in the Coyoacán district after 1973. The strangler simply vanished into the massive population of Mexico City, leaving behind a legacy of fear and a series of cold files. Sanchez never closed the case, and he spent the rest of his career walking the cobblestone streets with his eyes on the hands of every stranger he passed. He knew that the jasmine would bloom again, but the garden would never feel the same. The final outcome was a neighborhood that remained on edge for a generation. The people of Coyoacán began to install higher fences and more elaborate locks, turning their bohemian sanctuary into a fortress of private spaces. The red silk scarf became a symbol of urban danger, a reminder that the most beautiful things can be used for the most terrible purposes. The poet continued to walk the plazas, but he no longer knotted his string in public. The aftershock of the case led to a new way of analyzing crime scene signatures in Mexico, focusing on the technical habits of the offender rather than just the choice of victim. But for Captain Sanchez, the failure to catch the strangler was a weight that he carried into his retirement. He lived in a house near the garden and would often sit on the stone bench where the first scarf was found. He would watch the shadows of the old haciendas and wonder if the killer was still out there, waiting for the wind to change. The final image of the story is a single red silk scarf caught in the iron gate of an old hacienda. It is frayed and faded from the sun, but the knot that holds it in place is still tight and perfect. The scent of jasmine is heavy in the air, masking the smell of the city and the memory of the grass. It is a monument to a predator who knew how to tie a knot that time could not undo. The city moves on, but the shadows stay long. The silent, Historic plazas of Mexico City are a world away from the rainy, dark highways of Northern California. In a place where the redwoods tower over the asphalt like ancient judges, a different kind of predator was looking for a ride. As the blinding glare of high beams hits the rearview mirror, the silence of the forest is about to be broken by a single high school ring. On a Tuesday afternoon in October 1971, Ann Chapman walked through the lobby of the Olympic Palace Hotel in Athens, Greece. The air outside was a heavy, dry heat that smelled of dust and roasted coffee. Ann was 25 years old, a British journalist with a sharp eye for detail and a reputation for asking the kind of questions that made people in power uncomfortable. She smoothed her skirt and checked her watch, noting that she was exactly on time for her next appointment. Greece in the early 70s was a land of ancient beauty, held in the iron grip of a military junta. The streets of Athens were filled with the sound of military vehicles and the watchful eyes of the secret police, known as the ESA. Anne moved through this landscape with the confidence of a professional who believed her foreign press pass was a shield. She spent her mornings interviewing local politicians and her evenings writing dispatches that she hoped would expose the truth of the regime to the world. Her daily life in the city was a series of measured, professional beats that kept her grounded in a world of growing paranoia. She would begin her day with a strong Greek coffee in the hotel courtyard, followed by a walk to the International Press Center to file her stories. She had a habit of checking the lining of her briefcase twice before leaving her room, a small ritual to ensure her notes were secure. Her near-future hope was to finish her assignment and return to London to celebrate her father's upcoming birthday. The environment of the city felt vibrant and historic, yet there was a low-grade tension that vibrated just beneath the surface of the sidewalk. Anne expected the week to proceed with the usual challenges of reporting in a country under martial law. She lived under the ordinary pressure of a deadline and the constant need to protect her sources from the authorities. The world inside the hotel was a sanctuary of international travelers and polished marble, a place that felt immune to the darkness of the streets. Even as the sun began to set and the cicadas in the olive trees started their rhythmic, buzzing chorus, the city remained a place of intense light and deep shadows. Anne watched the traffic move around Syntagma Square, the headlights reflecting off the white stone of the buildings. She expected to have a quiet dinner and spend the night reviewing the documents she had gathered that afternoon. The heat of the Athenian afternoon was a constant, familiar weight on her shoulders. The first strange detail appeared when Anne returned to her room and found her British passport lying on the middle of her bed. She was certain she had tucked it into the inner pocket of her bag before heading out to her lunch meeting. She picked up the small blue book and checked the pages, finding that nothing had been taken or altered. It was a silent message, a sign that someone had been in her private space and wanted her to know they could reach her at any time. She decided to take a walk to clear her head, heading toward a quiet field of olive trees located just a few hundred yards from the back entrance of the hotel. The path was dusty and lined with ancient stone walls that glowed in the fading orange light of the evening. She noticed a dark car idling near the trailhead, its engine making a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Two men were sitting inside, their faces obscured by the glare of the setting sun on the windshield. As she moved deeper into the grove, the sound of the city began to fade, replaced by the dry rustle of the olive leaves in the wind. She realized that the dark car had moved from the trailhead and was now slowly following her along the narrow dirt path. Anne quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked for a way back to the main road. This was the point of no return, a moment where the assignment was replaced by a struggle for survival. The dry heat of the Athenian afternoon feels like a physical hand pressing against your throat while the smell of parched earth and pine needles fills your lungs. The shadows of the olive trees stretch across the path like long, dark fingers that threaten to pull you into the soil. If I can just make it to the lights of the hotel, the world will turn back into a place where the rules still matter. Anne never made it back to the hotel. Her body was found the following morning in the dusty field, lying beneath the silver-green branches of an old olive tree. Her hands had been tied behind her back with a series of professional, tight knots that suggested the work of someone with military training. She had been strangled, and her clothing had been disturbed in a way that looked clinical and staged. The British journalist had been silenced in the heart of a city she had come to document. The investigation began within the hour, but the atmosphere inside the Greek police headquarters was cold and dismissive. The local authorities quickly arrested a man named Nicholas Mundus, claiming that he had encountered Anne in the grove and committed a simple crime of passion. They ignored the professional nature of the binding and the fact that Anne had been investigating the very people who were now handling the case. The logic of the state was to close the file as quickly as possible. The voice of the international press turned cold and reconstructive as Scotland Yard sent their own investigators to Athens to review the evidence. They noted that the crime scene had been scrubbed of any physical traces and that the witness statements provided by the Greek police were riddled with contradictions. The first theory of a random attack began to fall apart under the weight of the political reality. Anne Chapman was not a victim of a local criminal. She was a victim of a regime that could not afford her questions. A second theory emerged involving the ESA. The feared secret police, who were known for their brutal methods and their surveillance of foreign journalists. Witnesses near the hotel remembered seeing the dark car and the two men, identifying them as operatives who had been following Anne for several days. But in the Greece of 1971, the secret police were untouchable, and their records were hidden behind a wall of state secrets. The mystery of the olive grove widened as the political pressure mounted. The twist in the case arrived decades later when the military junta finally collapsed and the secret files of the regime were opened to the public. Investigators found evidence that Anne had been targeted because she had discovered a connection between the Greek elite and a series of illegal arms deals. The scene in the olive grove had been carefully staged to look like a common murder, a macabre piece of theater designed to distract the international community from the political nature of the hit. Despite the new evidence and the efforts of her father, Edward Chapman, no one was ever officially charged with the murder of Anne Chapman. Edward spent the rest of his life traveling to Athens, conducting his own investigations and challenging the Greek authorities to tell the truth. He died without ever receiving a confession or seeing the men in the dark car face a courtroom. The case remains a chilling bridge between a common crime and a state-sponsored disappearance. The final outcome was a cold file in the archives of two different nations, a story of a journalist who went looking for the truth and found only the silence of the trees. Anne's notes and her briefcase were never returned to her family, having vanished into the bureaucracy of the junta. The Olympic Palace Hotel eventually changed its name, and the field of olive trees was cleared to make way for new housing developments. The memory of the night in 1971 was buried beneath the white stone of the modern city. The aftershock of the murder led to new international protections for journalists working in conflict zones and a deeper scrutiny of the Greek military government. But for the family of Anne Chapman, the only thing that remained was a single British passport and the memory of a girl who believed in the power of the word. The silence of the olive groves was a weight they carried for over 30 years. The truth was out there, but it was buried in a grave that had no name. The final image of the case is a British passport lying on a white bedspread in a quiet hotel room. The sun is setting behind the Parthenon, casting a long and dark shadow across the floor where a traveler once stood. It is a reminder that some questions come with a price that can never be fully repaid. The cicadas in the trees are the only ones who still know the sound of the struggle. We spend our entire lives building walls against the unknown. We buy locks for our doors and cameras for our porches, convinced that safety is a thing we can own. But the truth is much quieter than that. Safety is not a fortress. It is a fragile agreement we make with the world every single morning. None of the people in these accounts woke up expecting a disaster. They were making coffee or checking the mail. They were thinking about the weekend or a bill that needed to be paid. Evil does not usually arrive with a warning. It slides into the gaps of a normal day when we are looking the other way. The most terrifying thing about the dark is that it does not always live in a forest or an alley. Sometimes it lives in the apartment next door. It sits at the desk across from yours and drinks the same coffee. It has a face that looks exactly like safety. We only see the cracks when the light begins to fade. A single choice is often the hinge upon which a whole life turns. A decision to take a shortcut, to answer a knock, or to trust a voice can change everything in a second. We look back at these moments and call them mistakes. But in the moment, they happened. They felt like nothing more than the next step. We like to believe that we would have seen the danger coming. We tell ourselves that we are more observant or more careful than those who came before us. But intuition is a quiet whisper that is easily drowned out by the noise of a routine. We choose the comfort of the familiar over the chill of the truth. The geography of our lives is mapped by the places where we feel secure. Our homes, our schools, and our favorite streets are the boundaries of our world. When someone vanishes from these spaces, the map itself begins to dissolve. The landscape remains the same, but the air inside it becomes heavy and cold. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a disappearance. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a question that has no answer. It lives in the empty chairs and the untouched shoes left by the door. It is a reminder that a human life is a collection of thousands of tiny, moving parts. We process these tragedies as stories because the alternative is too heavy to carry. If we admit that safety is an illusion, then every shadow becomes a threat. So we turn the victims into names and the events into dates. We build a wall of words between ourselves and the reality of what happened in the dark. The weight of a single second is a burden that the survivors carry forever. They replay that moment in their minds, wondering if a different word or a different look could have changed the outcome. They live in the what if, a landscape where the past is a maze with no exit and no light to guide them. Human trust is a beautiful and dangerous thing. It is the glue that holds our communities together. Yet it is also the very thing that a predator uses as a weapon. They count on our decency. They rely on the fact that we want to be helpful and kind. They turn our best qualities into a path toward the end. Every name we have discussed today belonged to a person with a future that felt certain. They had plans for tomorrow and hopes for the next year. They were not characters in a mystery. They were the centers of their own universes. When their light went out, the world became a slightly darker place for everyone. The ordinary world is a mask that covers the complexity of the human spirit. Beneath the surface of a quiet street, there are currents of greed and resentment that we rarely acknowledge. We prefer the mask because it allows us to sleep. We only look beneath it when the screaming starts or the silence becomes too long. We often talk about the banality of evil, the idea that the most terrible acts are committed by unremarkable people. It is a chilling thought because it means the monster does not have to be a stranger. It can be the person who mows your lawn or the teacher who knows your name. It is the horror of the mundane. There is a lesson in the small choices we make every day. We should listen to the cold prickle on the back of our neck and the sudden, unexplained urge to walk away. These are the echoes of 1,000,000 years of survival, a biological warning that something in the environment has shifted out of its proper place. The victims in these stories are gone, but the questions they left behind remain. They challenge us to look at our own lives with a bit more clarity and a bit less complacency. They remind us that the distance between a normal day and a nightmare is often just the width of a single, unlocked wooden door. We share these accounts not to celebrate the darkness, but to honor the light that was taken. We speak their names so that they do not become just another cold file in a police cabinet. There is a dignity in remembering the truth, even when the truth is a jagged and painful thing to hold in your own hands. The aftershock of a crime ripples through time, touching people who were never even there. It changes the way a neighborhood breathes and the way a family speaks to one another. A single act of violence creates a debt that can never be fully repaid. It leaves a scar on the very fabric of the community. If these stories have stayed with you, perhaps consider staying with us. It is a small way to ensure these names are not forgotten in the rush of the world. We are a community of people who look into the shadows because we know that the light is only half of the story. Your presence here matters to us. Take a moment tonight to appreciate the quiet of your own home. Look at the people you love and the walls you have built to keep them safe. Recognize the fragility of that peace and the beauty of a day where nothing went wrong. It is a gift that we often overlook until we see how easily it can be taken. The sun will rise tomorrow on a world that looks exactly the same as it did today. But for some, the map has changed forever. They will be looking at the same streets and the same trees, but they will be seeing the ghosts of what used to be. They are the guardians of a history that the rest of us only visit. The final image of any tragedy is not the crime scene, but the empty space left behind. It is the silence of a room that should be filled with laughter, or the stillness of a street that should be busy. We live in those spaces every day, unaware of the weight they carry. We are walking through a sea of echoes. Every story we tell is a brick in a wall of understanding. We are trying to build a world where the shadows have no place to hide. But until that day comes, we will continue to watch the night and listen for the sounds that do not belong. We will stay awake so that others can sleep in their fragile peace. The human spirit is resilient, but it is also easily broken. We are capable of profound kindness and unimaginable cruelty, often within the same hour. This paradox is the core of the human condition. It is the reason we are so fascinated by the dark. We are looking for a reflection of ourselves in the void. As you turn out the lights tonight, remember that the ordinary is a privilege. The mundane routine of your life is the very thing that others would give everything to have back. Cherish the boring moments and the quiet evenings. They are the true anchors of a life well lived. They are the real substance of safety. We are moving through history together, each of us a thread in a vast and complicated tapestry. Some threads are cut short and others are woven into patterns we do not understand. But every thread has a value, and every story has a meaning. We are the witnesses to the patterns that emerge from the darkness. The darkness is not something to be feared if we are willing to carry a light. The truth is that light, a cold and steady flame that reveals the world as it truly is. We do not look away, because looking away does not make the danger disappear. We look so that we can find our way back to the shore. There is a comfort in the shared experience of these accounts. It reminds us that we are not alone in our curiosity or our concern. We are part of a long tradition of people who sit around the fire and tell stories of the things that go bump in the night. It is a way of reclaiming the night for ourselves. The people whose lives we explored today are no longer here to tell their own stories. We have taken on that responsibility for them. We have tried to capture the essence of who they were before the world broke them. We hope we have done justice to their memory and to the gravity of the choices they faced. The lesson of the choice is that we must be present in our own lives. We cannot sleepwalk through our days and expect to stay safe. We must be the active protagonists of our own journeys, always aware of the environment and the people around us. We must be the ones who decide which door to open and when. Safety is a collective effort. It requires us to look out for one another and to speak up when something feels wrong. It is the vigilance of a community that keeps the predator at bay. We are each other's keepers, and the strength of our bond is the only thing that can truly hold back the rising tide. The final drop of any story is the one that stays with you when the screen goes dark. It is the image that recurs in your dreams, or the thought that enters your mind when you are alone in a quiet room. It is the weight of the truth. We hope that weight serves as a guide rather than a burden in your life. The night is long, but it is not infinite. The dawn will come, and the world will be revealed once again. But for now, we sit in the quiet and we remember. We honor the missing, and we learn from the fallen. We are the storytellers and the listeners, bound together by the mysteries of the human heart. The geography of fear is a map that we all carry inside us. It tells us where to walk and who to trust. But that map is only as accurate as the stories we are willing to hear. By exploring the dark, we are updating our internal compass. We are learning how to navigate a world that is not always kind. We close this episode with a sense of gratitude for your time and your attention. These are not easy stories to hear, but they are necessary ones. They ground us in the reality of the human experience and remind us of the value of the lives we lead. Thank you for walking through these shadows with us today. The light invitation to stay with us is always open. We will be here, ready to share the next account and the next mystery. There is always another name to remember and another truth to uncover. We are the keepers of the late night hours, and we are honored to have you as part of our growing community. The final word is not one of fear, but of awareness. Be conscious of the world around you and the choices you make. Trust your instincts and value your safety. The ordinary day is a beautiful thing, and it is worth protecting with everything you have. We will see you in the next story. Good night for now. As the silence returns to your room, listen to the sound of your own heart. It is the rhythmic beat of a life that is still moving forward. It is the most important sound in the world. Hold on to it, and let it lead you through the darkness until the morning comes. The light is waiting for you just ahead. The stories are over, but the echoes remain. They are the faint vibrations in the air that tell us the world is still full of mystery. We are the ones who listen to the echoes. We are the ones who find the meaning in the noise. We are the people of the late night, and we are not afraid of the dark. Final outcome is always the same. We return to our lives with a bit more wisdom and a bit more caution. We have seen the truth and we have heard the names. We are the witnesses. The episode ends here, but the memory of the light will stay with you. Take care of yourselves and each other out there today.